Thank you, Madam President. Now, this is a joyful and celebratory day, but I'd like to begin on a serious note and offer my prayers and best wishes to Buffalo Bill's safety, Damar Hamlin, and his family. What happened last night was one of the most horrifying things.
The Senate is not in order. Will people please take their conversations out of the chamber?
What happened last night was one of the most horrifying things I've ever seen watching football, and I watch a lot of it. And we're all rooting and praying for his recovery. Damar, we're with you every step of the way in spirit. You make us proud. We can't wait to see you up and healthy again soon. Now, Madam President, let me begin by wishing you and all of my colleagues a Happy New Year. It's good to see everyone as we observe this special, joyful, and solemn day. Today marks the beginning of the 118th Congress. It's the start of a new chapter in the grand history of this chamber, a moment for renewal, reflection, rededication. For those going through this process for the first time, days like this can seem overwhelming, almost like the first day of school. But beneath the celebrations and receptions, a solemn truth permeates everything we do today. We're here because the American people have entrusted us to represent their needs in this great body. So today is historic for many reasons. First, let me congratulate all my colleagues from both sides of the aisle who have just been sworn in, especially my newest Democratic colleagues, Peter Welch of Vermont and John Fetterman of Pennsylvania. I commend all of you for this immense honor, and I challenge each of you and myself as a friend and a colleague. I challenge each of you as a friend and a colleague not to let this opportunity go to waste. I will challenge myself for that as well. Because ours is truly an awesome responsibility. And I mean awesome in the biblical sense, not in the way my teenage daughters used to say it, but the kind of awe that would cause the angels to tremble before God. This responsibility is indeed awesome. In our hands lie the trust, the wishes, the hopes, and the burdens of the American people. It is a most grave charge, but a rewarding one if done right. I want to recognize another member making history today. My friend from Washington State, Senator Patty Murray, will become the newest President pro tem, the first woman in history of the Senate to hold this title. There is no one I trust more to be third in the line of presidential succession than Senator Murray. She's brilliant, pragmatic, and someone who gets things done in this chamber. Congratulations also to my friend, the Republican leader, Mitch McConnell, on now becoming the longest-serving party leader in the history of this chamber. We have a lot of work together. We have a lot of work ahead of us, so I hope we can find some ways to come together and not succumb to gridlock for the good of this chamber and for the good of our country. Of course, I want to thank all of my Democratic colleagues for trusting me with 2 more years as leader. There's no group I'd rather work with than this amazing caucus. You're not just my colleagues, you're my friends. With only 50 votes, ranging from Joe Manchin to Bernie Sanders, we made history these last 2 years by passing the most ambitious legislative agenda in decades, since at least the Great Society and perhaps the New Deal. All members, whether returning to Congress or retiring, can feel proud about what we've accomplished in the last 2 years. And let's not forget, and I say this in good part to my Republican colleagues, that 5 of our 6 major bills last year were bipartisan. And I'm proud to be making some history of my own today. Today I have the great honor of becoming the longest-serving senator from New York, the first New Yorker ever elected to the Senate 5 times. To every single New Yorker who trusted me with another term as senator, thank you. And my mentor and former colleague, Pat Moynihan, taught me that you have to dream big to properly serve the people of New York. And I've tried to do that every day in office, visiting each of the 62 counties every year, meeting as many people as possible, and listening to as many New Yorkers as I can. My beloved mentor, Senator Moynihan, served 4 terms. So to be elected to a 5th term is humbling, awe-inspiring, and it energizes me to keep going and keep delivering. So thank you, New York, for this honor, and you can be sure that every day I get up in the morning, I will give it my all to fight and deliver for you. But of course, I cannot do it alone. Today, I want to thank all of my staff whose relentlessness and determination are only matched by their talent and deep love for this country. Though impossible to name all of them, I must single out one in particular, one of the very best, Steve Mann, my Deputy State Director. He came down today to watch me get sworn in as the longest-serving senator from New York. And when I do, Steve Mann will have some history to celebrate on his own as he claims the mantle of the longest-serving Senate staffer I've ever had. He started with me right from the very beginning. Steve is everything you'd want in a staffer: hardworking, loyal, caring, and a Yankee fan. But unfortunately, he's also a Cowboy fan. Not everyone's perfect, as I remind him about the Cowboys. Kidding aside, Steve, a Rensselaer, New York native, took a chance on me years ago when I first ran for office, and he never looked back. Though both of our job titles have evolved over the years, one has remained: friend. To my newly arriving colleagues, I hope all of you one day can have a Steve Mann working with you. And if you're lucky enough, maybe yours too will become a dear friend. Finally, I cannot forget the most important people in my life. Here with me is my wife, Iris, my daughters, Jessica and Allison, Allison's wife, Biz, and he kept quiet during the swearing in. I was very relieved, my 4-year-old grandson, Noah. They are part of my greater family, and they are my biggest supporters, motivators, and the unsung heroes of my life. And though he's no longer with us, I know my dad is looking down, smiling today. We miss him every single day, but I know he's right here with us in spirit. Now, Madam President, now is the time to set our sights on the future. As we begin the 118th Congress, this Senate Democratic majority enters the new year in a stronger position than anyone ever expected. We have a lot of challenges ahead, but this majority is ready to meet them. We will be relentless, flexible, and work with the other side to get things done. It won't be easy moving forward under a divided government, but after everything we've accomplished with an evenly split Senate and a narrowly divided House, there's no reason we can't keep the streak going moving forward. Let's not forget, as I mentioned, 5 of our 6 major bills last year were done on a bipartisan basis. So let me say it again. After everything we've accomplished in an evenly divided Senate and a narrowly divided House, there's no reason both sides can't keep working together for the good of our country, our beloved country. That doesn't mean we'll agree all the time or even much of the time. It doesn't mean we'll ignore our differences or compromise on our values. We won't do that. But party differences do not absolve either side of the need to work together when the good of the country is on the line. If both sides are willing to give it a good faith effort, I'm optimistic we can be successful, far more successful than many might think. After all, Madam President, if you said 2 years ago that a 50-50 Senate would finish as one of the most successful since the Great Society, the naysayers would have said that's crazy talk. They would have said a 50-50 Senate is doomed to languish in gridlock. But let's take a look at everything we accomplished over the last 2 years and be proud of it. With no margin for error, this majority enacted the historic Inflation Reduction Act and confirmed the most diverse collection of judges, 97 in total, in American history. With bipartisan support, we enacted a historic infrastructure bill. After decades of trying, both sides passed the first gun safety bill in over 30 years. We approved the CHIPS and Science Act, passed the PACT Act, and stood with our friends in Ukraine. And just a few weeks ago, both sides worked together to enact marriage equality and the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act. All of this done in an equally divided Senate. All of this done with a narrowly divided House. So I hope we can continue to get things done, even with a narrowly controlled Republican House. For whoever ends up becoming Speaker of the House, I hope they will find a way to work with us in a productive way this Congress. Senate Democrats are ready to reach across the aisle and across the Capitol to accomplish big things that will benefit all Americans. So to close, Madam President, after everything we've accomplished over the last 2 years, America is stronger, healthier, and better prepared for the future, thanks to the Senate working together. And we must continue. If Republicans are willing to work with us in the new year, they will be met with an open hand. If they are willing to come to the table, we'll sit right down and do the difficult work of legislating for the people. And if they're willing to set their sights on making our country better together, there's no reason why the success of the last 2 years need to end today. There's much that we should be proud of from the 117th Congress. There's much we can be hopeful for in the 118th. Let us therefore begin the work anew, mindful of the challenges to come, but determined without ceasing to reward the trust the American people have placed in us. I yield the floor. President, today the thoughts of the Senate are with the people of Monterey Park, California, as they heal from this weekend's tragic and terrible shooting. What should have been a weekend of joy and celebration within the AAPI community as they celebrate the Lunar New Year turned into another occasion of grief and mourning. I spoke yesterday with the sheriff of Los Angeles County and assured him that the federal government is ready to provide whatever assistance they need right now. While first responders are still investigating the causes of this incident, it's clear that the prevalence of guns in our country has made tragedies like this one too frequent. While the Senate passed bipartisan gun safety legislation last year, and that was a very welcome move, more should be done. My thoughts are with all the families and the loved ones of the victims of this insidious attack. I thank all the first responders and even the private citizens who responded quickly to stop the shooter and prevent even more lives from tragically being cut short. Now, Mr. President, Madam President, and I want to also welcome our new colleague from Nebraska and wish him the best. Now, Mr. President, this week, for the first time in the 118th Congress, both chambers gavel into session to begin anew the work of serving the American people. It's a new era here in Congress, an era of divided government where both parties will have to demonstrate they can work together to solve our nation's problems. Democrats begin the 118th Congress with an open hand of cooperation, and I urge my Republican colleagues to respond in kind so we can hit the ground running. We have a lot of difficult and important work ahead of us, perhaps none more important than working together to raise the debt ceiling and protecting the full faith and credit of the United States. In America, when it's time to pay the bills, we have followed through on our obligations without any exception. In the months to come, I expect we're going to hear a lot from our Republican colleagues about the debt ceiling. So let me begin by making a few things perfectly clear at the onset. First, few issues require more bipartisanship, cooperation, and serious-mindedness than making sure that America is able to pay its debts on time. At stake is the health of our economy and the very stability of the global financial system. Should the U.S. default on its debt, the consequences could be severe, and it's going to affect just about every average American family. This is not some esoteric issue that's just abstract and way up there in the clouds. It's going to affect all of us. Listen to what could happen if we default. Interest rates will go up on mortgages, on car loans, on credit cards. Pensions, the money people had put aside, will lose billions. So will IRAs and 401ks in all likelihood. Home values will decline because when mortgage interest rates go up, people are willing to pay less for homes. That's lots of money to lots of people. For many people, their home is their rock. It's all they have. And by playing bricksmanship, some of the MAGA Republicans on the other side of the aisle, on the other side of in the House, are risking just that. So again, this is not an abstract issue. Real Americans will see real dollars from so much of what they own disappear, from their pensions, their IRAs, their home value. Merely approaching a default could raise costs on everything, from mortgages and car loans to credit card interest rates. So it's going to hurt average families. This is not an abstract argument. And as the months go on, as we get closer and closer to the day that we have to act, the American people will see this, and we're going to make sure of that. Second, raising the debt ceiling has consistently been a bipartisan responsibility for decades. Neither party has played brinksmanship. Since the 1960 debt ceiling has been raised since 1960, the debt ceiling has been raised approximately 80 times under both Republican and Democratic administrations, under both unified and divided government. I will note once again that while President Trump was in office and Republicans had the House and Senate, Democrats voted to raise the debt ceiling. We did it not once, not twice, but 3 times, including twice under Republican majorities in the House and Senate. Of course, we could have done what some MAGA Republicans want, threatening to block debt ceiling extensions unless we got our way. But we knew how badly it would hurt the American people, and we didn't do it. This time should be no different. Brinksmanship, hostage-taking, default on the debt should be off the table. Both parties should work together to ensure we can continue to pay our debt on time. And we Democrats are ready to move quickly in order to make that happen. Indeed, we are ready to move well in advance of default, because even brinksmanship over the debt ceiling can cause serious damage to the economy and to individual American families. Unfortunately, Madam President, unfortunately, House Republicans have kicked off their new majority by saying yes to brinksmanship, yes to hostage-taking, and yes, even to risking default, all because of draconian spending cuts pushed by the hard right. House Republicans' approach to the debt ceiling is dangerous, destabilizing, and the only thing it accomplishes is making a bipartisan solution less likely. If Republicans want to show that they can govern effectively, they're off to a pretty poor start. If House Republicans are serious about taking the debt limit hostage in exchange for spending cuts, the new rules that they adopted require them to bring a proposal to the floor of the House and show the American people precisely what kind of cuts they want to make. It's not enough to hide behind the old GOP talking point about wasteful spending. When you're in the majority, substance counts. If Republicans are talking about draconian cuts, they have an obligation to show Americans what those cuts are and let the public react. And let them do it now, not 6 months from now when the danger of default is much closer. House Republicans, you voted for rules that require regular order for bringing bills to the floor. So put your proposals for debt ceiling on the floor, let the entirety of the House debate it and vote on it, and let the American people see and assess these cuts for themselves. Otherwise, Americans are going to be left with some pretty big questions. Republicans say they want spending cuts. Well, does that mean cuts to Social Security, or Medicare, or child care, or Pell Grants, or our military, or pay raises for our troops, or funding police and law enforcement? Many House Republicans are serious about cutting national defense in exchange for raising the debt ceiling. I hope they're not, but many seem to be. Or maybe they're pushing cuts to public health and nurses and hospitals. Whatever the case may be, Americans deserve to know what kind of cuts Republicans want to make and why they think it is worth forcing an unnecessary crisis that will hurt most American families. Frankly, I expect the House Republicans themselves will struggle to come up with a serious answer, because deep down they know that no matter what they propose, their cuts are likely to be deeply unpopular with the American people. This is the central quandary of the new majority. By yielding so much to the whims of the MAGA hard right, House Republicans have boxed themselves in and now have to choose between serving the American people or pleasing the extremists within their ranks. We are already seeing this play out when it comes to the debt ceiling. I yield the floor. Now, Mr. President, just a few moments before you assume the chair, Senator Murray opened the Senate as President pro tem for the first time. Kudos, congratulations. She's a great, great member. She's chair of appropriations and now PPT, and it was a wonderful thing to see her open up the Senate for the first time as PPT. So congratulations to Murray and to all of us for having such a good President Pro Tem. Now, on to business. In no time at all, the House Republicans are off to the rockiest start of any new majority in recent memory. Have you ever seen anything like this? We aren't even in a month into the new Congress, and already the House GOP has shown the American people they've been consumed by chaos, paralyzed by division, and held captive by the most extreme elements of their conference. On their first day of voting, the very first day, House Republicans decided their first order of business as the new majority was to pass legislation making it easier for ultra-rich tax cheats to escape accountability. Amazing. That's their first thing. And at the same time, as they did that, they would blow a hole, a $100 billion hole in the deficit. Because according to CBO, the amount of money brought into the federal treasury by closing some of these loopholes against tax cheats, very wealthy tax cheats, would far exceed the expenditure made for the new IRS agents. The deficit would come down if we passed this legislation. For all the talk on the other side, we got to bring down the deficit. Not when it comes to closing tax loopholes of the ultra-rich and corporations that paid a smaller percentage than most Americans. Wow. Apparently, cutting taxes for mega corporations and the 1% was not enough for Republicans 5 years ago. They did that in the Trump tax bill. Now they want to make things easier, even easier for tax cheats. And then, a few days later, the House Republicans doubled down on their war on women by passing measures that will undermine women's freedom of choice. Make no mistake, these bills will never see the light of day in the Senate. But again, the extreme MAGA fringe element of the Republican Party seems to be controlling the whole entity. We hope that doesn't last for long. We in the Senate will serve as an inextinguishable firewall and stop the anti-women, anti-health, anti-choice bills in their tracks. So right off the bat, the House Republicans are showing us exactly whose corner they are in, the ultra-rich and the fringe elements of their party. Now, make no mistake, Mr. President, Democrats want to work with a competent and capable Republican Party wherever possible to make life better for average Americans. Democrats are united in this commitment because we all saw firsthand how bipartisanship was the key to so many of last year's successes. Later today, in fact, I will join President Biden, Leader Jeffries, and a number of Senate and House colleagues precisely to talk about how we can turn our unity into action to help the American people. House Republicans, meanwhile, seem trapped in a cycle of extremism, so powerful that now they're even giving proposals like a national sales tax, serious consideration. According to some House Republicans, House leadership has agreed to give GOP radicals a vote on a 30% national sales tax on all goods across the board. That means right now, as inflation finally begins to drop, Republicans are looking to make Americans pay 30% more for everything they buy. Look, if Republicans want to have a debate with Democrats on their national sales tax bill, we'll be happy to have it. We love to hear Republicans explain to the American people why it's a good idea to send prices skyrocketing from everything, from cars to groceries to diapers and everything in between. We'd love to hear Republicans tell seniors why their expenses would go up by a third after they spent a lifetime for retirement. And we'd love to hear Republicans explain to middle-class families why their taxes would increase by thousands of dollars a year while the ultra-rich see their taxes go down. If Republicans want to push this terrible proposal, they're welcome to make their case. Make our day. I think many within the Republicans' own ranks recognize that a national sales tax is especially a dim-witted idea. Even Grover Norquist, whose ideas on tax are far away from most Americans, But he said it's one of the most, and he's one of the most conservative voices out there, he called it, quote, a terrible idea. Even Steve Forbes said this would make the average new home in this country cost $100,000 more. Young family, you want to buy a home? Some of our Republican friends want to add $100,000 to the cost of buying that home. And, of course, it would raise bills by thousands more. And yet, despite the insanity of this idea, the House Republican leadership has bent to the MAGA wing of the Republican Party and promised to vote. If this is how House Republicans want to spend their time, taxing middle-class families, attacking women's freedom of choice, giving cover to tax cheats, be our guest. And once again, Mr. President, this is the central quandary of the new Republican majority. By bending to the demands of the MAGA hard right, Speaker McCarthy has guaranteed that Republicans will have to constantly cater to the whims of the MAGA wing at the expense of the American people. Now, we will be a firewall against all of these things. And I'm sure the American people are glad that we have a Democratic majority in the Senate to stop some of these rather insane proposals. Because when extremists run the show, as it seems to be happening in the House, it makes it nearly impossible to have serious-minded, constructive conversations on the big issues that matter. And no issue, of course, will matter more in the coming months than raising the debt ceiling. Over the next few months, we're going to hear more about the debt ceiling in Congress, maybe more than any other issue. But the matter is very simple. If the U.S. is allowed to default on its debt for the first time, the consequences will be severe, and every single American will pay the price. A default means interest rates will spike on everything, from car loans to credit cards to mortgages. It means that Americans will have to pay thousands of dollars more on regular expenses. Homes will lose their value. Homes, the average middle-class person's piece of the rock that they struggle and save for so they can own a home, so they don't have to pay rent and can pay a mortgage where they get equity. Those homes will lose their value if we default, God forbid, on the debt, because mortgage rates interest soar, and that means people have less money to pay for a home, and supply and demand just says the price goes down, the value goes down. Meanwhile, the millions of Americans who have saved for retirement will see their retirement plans like 401ks lose their value, robbing retirees of their hard-earned livelihoods. So the dangers of default are not abstract. Oh no, this is not some academic argument up there in the clouds. This affects every American family, and we're going to make sure they hear all about it. The consequences are as real as they get, and the entire world is watching what we do here in Congress. But rather than work with Democrats in a productive, constructive way to raise the debt ceiling, the House GOP has immediately resorted to brinksmanship and hostage-taking. They say they will not raise the debt ceiling unless we give in to their demands for draconian spending cuts that would impact just about every American, again, in a very bad way. Well, I say to my Republican colleagues, if you want to talk about deep cuts, then you have an obligation to show the American people precisely what kind of cuts are you talking about. Are you going to hold Social Security? Are Republicans going to hold Social Security hostage in exchange for the debt ceiling, or pay raises for our troops, or support for veterans, or funding for police and fire and first responders, or Medicare funding that millions of seniors rely on? Republicans, you owe the American people answers on what you mean by spending cuts. Remember, the House rules that the GOP approved are clear. They need to bring a debt ceiling bill to the floor. Let the entirety of the House debate it and vote on it, and let the American people see and assess the cuts for themselves. So once again, to my House GOP colleagues, if you're serious about spending cuts, show us the math. Show us why you think it is worth risking a global financial crisis just to pass an extremist agenda. Because inevitably, what you're saying are cuts are vital to so many Americans, so many Americans. Being in the majority means that it won't be enough to hide behind time-worn rhetoric about wasteful spending. When it comes to the debt ceiling, the substance counts, the details count, the consequences are very, very real. And unless Republicans can resolve their own chaos and beat back their own extremism, I fear that every day that passes without action on the debt ceiling will increase the risk of default and risk the great harm it will do to the American people. And should that happen, Americans will see that the fault lies entirely in the hands of the radical GOP. I yield the floor. Note the absence of quorum. Now, Mr. President, House Republicans are struggling to grasp a harsh reality about being in the majority. There is no good substitute for having a plan. You can't solve the nation's biggest problems without a plan we can debate in Congress and which the American people can judge for themselves. This is especially true when it comes to the debt ceiling. Later this afternoon, President Biden will meet with Speaker McCarthy for their first one-on-one meeting of the year. And everyone is asking the same question of Speaker McCarthy. Show us your plan. Where is your plan, Republicans? Where is your plan, Speaker McCarthy? For days, Speaker McCarthy has heralded this sit-down as some kind of major win in his debt ceiling talks. But Speaker McCarthy is forgetting something obvious to everyone else. If you don't have a plan, you can't seriously pretend you're having any real negotiation. Let me say that again because it's so crystal clear. Speaker McCarthy, if you don't have a plan, you can't seriously pretend you're having any real negotiation. Speaker McCarthy showing up at the White House without a plan is like sitting down at the table without cards in your hand. And look, we know why the Speaker has struggled and is unable to produce a plan, is delaying it or avoiding it. He doesn't have the votes for one, in all likelihood. Some Senate Republicans want Social Security and Medicare cuts. Others want to cut health care, that Americans depend on through Medicaid. And at least one Republican said on raising the debt ceiling, I'm a no matter what. So Speaker McCarthy knows that it's next to impossible to pass a plan through his own House. Certainly without that, he can't do that. So Speaker McCarthy may claim he wants to negotiate, but that is ultimately empty talk if the hard right has the power to reject whatever the Speaker proposes. It's a toxic dynamic that sadly isn't going away anytime soon. When President Trump was in office, I sat down with him to talk about the importance of raising debt ceiling. And we didn't engage in threats or brinksmanship or hostage-taking. Instead, we Democrats presented a plan and moved forward from there. It was not easy. It took a lot of preparation and tough decision-making. But each time, we got the job done. So one more time, House Republicans, show us your plan. You have an obligation to be transparent with the American people. And if you don't have the votes to pass a plan, let's just get the debt ceiling done. And if the plan involves drastic cuts to millions of Americans, then Republicans have an obligation to show the American people what those cuts are, because Americans could be faced with the very painful results of those proposed cuts. Republicans owe it to the American people. Speaker McCarthy owes it to the American people to stop dodging, put pen to paper, and explain clearly how Congress is going to ensure the United States does not default for the first time in history. We Democrats have a plan. Raise the debt ceiling without brinksmanship or hostage-taking as it's been done before. Speaker McCarthy doesn't have a plan, so he is not really negotiating. And the clock is ticking. And finally, on election undermining by the Republican National Committee. One of the biggest lessons of last November was that for all the attempts by MAGA Republicans to undermine our elections, the roots of our democracy remain strong and run deep. For 2 years, we heard the same thing over and over again from the MAGA brigade, that the 2020 elections were stolen, that President Biden was illegitimate, that we couldn't trust that our votes were properly counted. Well, Americans simply didn't buy it. They saw that the elections were fair. Some have said these are the fairest elections we've ever had. Yet, and in every virtual race last fall, MAGA candidates who campaigned explicitly on denying the results of the 2020 election and overturning it were rejected by the voters. It was a good result for the country, for our democracy, and frankly, it was a necessary wake-up call for the GOP. telling them, get rid of the big lie once and for all. The American people aren't buying it. Maybe a small band of extreme right-wingers are, MAGA people, but not everybody else. So it was so disturbing to read in the Washington Post that the RNC is not so much abandoning the conspiracy of the big lie, so much as doubling down. According to reports, they are working on creating a permanent infrastructure in every state to ramp up election integrity activities as a way to cater that portion of their base that still believes in wacky election fraud conspiracies. As a sign of how unserious this report is, the RNC also makes unfounded claims of, quote, a continuing onslaught of Democratic election manipulation. I would call it ridiculous. It is ridiculous, but it's a troubling attempt to undermine our democracy. When people don't believe the elections are on the level, that's the beginning of the end of this grand experiment in democracy that has lasted for centuries. Fortunately, the American people are rejecting it, but the Republican, the MAGA wing, is keeping at it. I'll make this easy for the folks over at the RNC. Undermining our elections is a losing strategy. It's a loser, politically. It didn't work last year. It's not going to work next year. And for the sake of our country and the sake of the GOP, the RNC and the MAGA wing of the Republican Party needs to break the election fraud echo chamber that has paralyzed their party and, frankly, caused them to lose election after election. Now, chaos over there in the House on the Republican side. Each day that passes in Washington, two things hold true. We keep getting closer to default, but no closer to a Republican plan to lift the debt ceiling. I repeat once again, House Republicans, Speaker McCarthy, show us your plan. It's been more than a month since Speaker McCarthy and House Republicans began threatening the entire U.S. economy in order to secure drastic spending cuts that in all likelihood will hurt the American people badly. But in all this time, nobody can seem to get an answer to the $64,000 question. What cuts exactly are the Republicans proposing? Show us your plan. Some of the things we're hearing from the MAGA wing is the stuff of nightmares. Later this afternoon, I'll join with a number of Senate colleagues to shine a light on how devastating the radical MAGA cuts would be for American families if the MAGA Republicans got their way. But where is the House Republican plan? How are they going to lift the debt ceiling? After months of no answers, now Speaker McCarthy has recently claimed Republican leadership is trying to come up with a plan right now. I'm glad he's at least saying he wants to answer our question. Frankly, it's a lot easier said than done. And I don't think Speaker McCarthy will be able to unify his conference. It takes 218 votes, as we know, to pass anything in the House. And with a razor-thin GOP majority paralyzed by internal division, and with the stronghold the MAGA Republicans have on the Speaker, Speaker McCarthy will have a very difficult time getting everyone on the same page, if he can do it at all. To quote from Punch Bowl this morning, House Republicans, quote, face an intractable political math challenge as they seek to reduce the $1.4 trillion deficit, unquote. For one, Speaker McCarthy has insisted Republicans will only preserve the full faith and credit of the United States if they secure drastic spending cuts first. MAGA Republican hardliners have demanded Speaker McCarthy release a proposal to balance the budget over the next 10 years, one of the conditions for having supported his leadership. At the same time, Speaker McCarthy has also claimed Republicans won't touch Social Security and Medicare. Now, I'll believe that when I see it, because so many Republicans, not just a handful, so many have spent years going on record calling for cuts and changes and privatization of these programs. All this leads to a terrible conclusion, Mr. President. If Speaker McCarthy is going to meet these goals, Republicans would need to cut 85% of all discretionary spending in order to balance the budget in 10 years. Let me say that again. If Speaker McCarthy and House Republicans are serious about balancing the budget without touching in their 10-year plan, without touching Medicare and Social Security, they will need to cut 85% of all discretionary spending. That would be Republican austerity at an apocalyptic level. Teachers, nurses, firefighters, student loan borrowers, police officers would all kiss federal funding goodbye. Funding for scientific research, so vital in our competition with China, would likely disappear. Child hunger would spike without federal nutrition programs. Housing programs would be starved of resources. We'd be thrust into a greater housing crisis than we now have. So my point is this. Speaker McCarthy is not going to be able to keep his promise to balance the budget at 10 years while at the same time leaving Social Security and Medicare untouched. The math doesn't add up. Very soon, the MAGA brigade will see that the speaker made a bunch of promises that he won't be able to keep. And I worry greatly that the dangers of slipping into default will only increase as the toxic dynamic within the House GOP gets worse day by day. That's why it's so important that now, early on, the House Republicans show us their plan. On ESG in China, 2 more items, Mr. President. First, reports are out that Republicans will reintroduce a measure targeting a new rule from the Department of Labor that allows, repeat, allows, but not requires, fiduciaries to consider the impacts of climate change and other ESG issues when making investment decisions. Across the country, hard-right state legislatures are up in arms in trying to stop state investment funds from working with money managers who dare commit the oh-so-heinous offense at looking at the big picture, looking at the future when making investments, including how climate change and other issues can present financial risks. I just want to point out the obvious. Nothing in this DOL rule imposes any requirement on anyone. It is not a requirement. In fact, it goes out of the way to make sure decision-making remains solely in the hand of the fiduciary. Republicans like to talk about small government. They like to talk about letting the private sector do its work. But their obsession with eliminating ESG, their sort of ostrich-like view about climate change and the damage that carbon presents when going into the atmosphere would do just the opposite. Finally, on the China surveillance balloon and what happened over the weekend. After yesterday's briefing, it's clear our defense and intelligence agencies remain laser-focused on gathering every piece of information about what happened over U.S. and Canadian airspace. White House Press Secretary John Kirby said these most recent objects did not pose any direct threat to people on the ground. That's very important. People should not worry about that. Of course, we have much more to learn. Today, we're going to have another all-senators briefing on the state of U.S. defense readiness with respect to China. I'm sure that will include a discussion of the military, but also of our surveillance abilities. Republicans eager to score political points right at this moment are doing nothing more than engaging in premature attacks. It's precipitous. It's no time for premature partisanship. We need to work together in Congress to get to the bottom of what happened, which Senator Tester is taking the lead on here in the Senate. I thank him and all my colleagues of good faith for working together. I yield the floor. Mr. President.
The Majority Leader.
On AUMF first. Mr. President, 2 decades after the start of the Iraq War, the Senate this week debates legislation to repeal the authority that commenced the war to begin with. By a large vote, 67 to 28, the Senate yesterday sent a clear message that the time has come to repeal the AUMFs of 2002 and 1990. At this point, repealing the Iraq AUMFs in the Senate is not a matter of if, but rather of when. I hope, given such strong bipartisan vote yesterday, we can move quickly. There should be no needless delay or dilatory tactics on something the majority of senators support. We're in the process of negotiating amendments. We want to be reasonable, but this process is going to proceed as quickly as it can. Allowing these AUMFs to remain on the books is just asking for a future administration to abuse them and, God forbid, bumble us into a new conflict in the Middle East. War powers belong in the hands of Congress, and we should use and exert that authority by bringing these AUMFs to a close. It's my hope that both sides can reach an agreement to accelerate this process very soon. In the meantime, once again, thanks, kudos to Senators Kaine and Young, Chairman Menendez and Risch, and Ranking Member Risch, and all of the co-sponsors, there are many, of this legislation. Now on trains. After last month's terrible derailment in East Palestine, Norfolk Southern CEO Alan Shaw has a chance today to prove before the Senate Commerce Committee that his company is ready to fix the damage they have created. During this testimony, I hope Mr. Shaw will offer some candid answers to a number of very troubling questions. For example, if Mr. Shaw and rail executives truly care about safety, why did they spend years lobbying the Republican administration to claw away at regulations intended to keep people safe? What is Norfolk Southern doing to prevent future accidents like the one in East Palestine? And God forbid another one happens, how will Norfolk Southern ensure communities get the resources they need? I also want to hear Mr. Shaw explain why his company has engorged itself with stock buybacks when that money could have been spent on safety. Listen to this. Norfolk Southern has more than doubled the amount they spent on stock buybacks in the 5 years after the Trump tax law compared to the 5 years before it. In the same period, they cut jobs by thousands and lowered capital investments by billions. How is that justifiable? I understand that NTSB Chair Hamady is offering testimony as well. I hope we hear from her that the NTSB is ready to conduct a full investigation, not just into Norfolk Southern, but into all Class 1 freight rail companies, as I have asked her to do. Such an examination could shed light on the number of rail accidents, if they occurred in populated areas, which toxic chemicals were released. A full NTSB investigation could tell us which of these accidents occurred because the tracks were severely degraded or poorly designed. And a full investigation from the NTSB could tell us which negligent rail company policies contributed to the 2,700 deaths in recent years, and if any of these could have been prevented. The Senate deserves explanations. Americans in communities like East Palestine want answers. I hope today's hearing provides some so we can prevent rail disasters like the one in Ohio from happening again. Now, on House Republican comments at their retreat on debt ceiling. Undermining the full faith and credit of the United States is never a good idea. But in the aftermath of a bank collapse, it is supremely reckless. But that's precisely what some House Republicans, including the very chairman of the House Budget Committee, are doing right now. During House Republicans' annual retreat, House Budget Committee and other hard right-wingers said, quote, now is the best time to double down on debt ceiling brinkmanship, as news of SVB's collapse remains front of mind. That is reckless and truly clueless. It's both, reckless and clueless. Instead of calling for calm, House Republicans are sowing chaos by threatening default at a time when banks need stability. Again, instead of calling for calm, House Republicans are sowing chaos by threatening default at a time when banks need stability. It goes to show you how fringe and unserious the House GOP conference has become. Our Republican colleagues should remember that it was poor supervision and a rush under Trump to deregulate that caused the banking crisis. Banks that are well managed are not in crisis, even though they're dealing with the same macroeconomic conditions as everyone else. So what Republicans are saying is not only ridiculous and false, but dangerous. If you're a small business owner worried about keeping the lights on and paying your employees, what are you supposed to think when Republicans threaten default at a time like this with markets already on edge? If you're near retirement and have spent your whole life setting aside a little in order to retire with dignity, how would you feel if Republicans threatened your life savings by risking default? The right answer is for Republicans in the House to stop saber-rattling, drop the hostage-taking and brinksmanship, and work together, in a bipartisan way, to extend the debt ceiling without strings attached, without brinksmanship, without hostage-taking. But that will only happen once Republicans stop ducking from the American people and show us their plan. Republicans, show us your plan. Today's March 22nd. The debt ceiling date is getting closer and closer. Speaker McCarthy, it's been long enough. Where's your plan? Your Congress says it wants cuts. They've threatened default unless they get their cuts. So where's the plan? Instead of making radical comments that threaten even more financial turmoil, Republicans should focus more on solving the debt crisis by working with Democrats to ensure a default never occurs. Finally, Mr. President, yesterday we learned the sad news of the passing of one of the greatest New York Knicks legends of all times, the captain, Willis Reed. You can't write the story of the New York Knicks or the NBA without mentioning Willis Reed. He was a giant on and off the court, a ferocious competitor, a class act, and above all, a leader of leaders. In Game 7 of the 1970 NBA Finals, I so well remember it. Willis Reed authored one of the most memorable moments in sports history by hobbling out of the tunnel and walking onto the court minutes before the tip-off. That night, he gave a legendary performance against the Lakers while leading his team to one of 2 Knicks titles. We hope maybe it'll happen again soon. Willis Reed embodied what it meant to be a Knick, a New Yorker, a champion, and a legend. Our thoughts are with his family, friends, and teammates. May he rest in peace. And a little bit of good news. Today, we, the 118th Congress, will confirm President Biden's 118th judge. The 118th Congress will confirm President Biden's 118th judge. As you know, we have confirmed more judges at this point in a president's term than any of the previous 3 administrations. We are proud of how far we have come, and we're just getting started. I yield the floor. I ask unanimous consent the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Now, Mr. President, yesterday, by a large bipartisan vote, 65 to 28, the Senate invoked cloture on legislation repealing the Iraq AUMFs of 2002 and 1991. We'll continue voting on amendments over the course of today, and members should expect final passage on repealing the Iraq AUMF as soon as tomorrow. I want to thank both sides of the aisle for their cooperation and bipartisanship. This has been a reasonable process here on the floor, with votes on amendments brought forth by our Republican colleagues. I hope this process can serve as a blueprint for how the Senate can work on into the future, in the next few months for sure. We'll have amendments without being dilatory. We'll have debate without bogging down the process. We'll look for opportunities to advance bipartisan bills as we did over the past 2 years. So again, I hope this AUMF portends good things to come. I hope it can serve as a blueprint for how the Senate can work in this session of Congress as we work together to make our country a better place. I want to thank Senators Kaine and Young, Chairman Menendez, and all the co-sponsors of this legislation for their good work. But unfortunately, there are disturbing trends here in the Senate, and one of the most disturbing is what the senator from Alabama is doing to weaken our national security. For a long time, both parties have worked together to quickly confirm the routine promotions of generals and flag officers, without partisan bickering, without needless delay. Confirming military promotions is one of the most important responsibilities of the Senate, a charge that rises far above normal political fights. But today, one member, the senator from Alabama, is blocking the routine promotion of 160 general and flag officers because he objects to women within the military getting access to reproductive care. It's very simple. The senior senator wants Alabama to make the senior senator from Alabama wants to make the health care decisions for the women of our military. And the senator from Alabama is holding up scores of military nominees who have not done anything to be treated this way until he gets his way. The women of our military are more than capable of making their own decisions when it comes to their health. They do not need the senior senator from Alabama making decisions on their behalf. And they certainly do not need any senator throwing a wrench in the vital functioning of our military when our military, work every day to keep us safe. So the senator from Alabama risks permanently injecting politics into the confirmation of routine military promotions. The senator from Alabama risks permanently injecting politics into the confirmation of routine military promotions. And that would risk our entire national security. For what? So he can push the MAGA hard line on blocking women's choice, something that most women in this country, most people in this country reject? That is beyond the pale. Now, let's be clear. The senator from Alabama's delay of 160 routine military promotions is reckless. It puts American security in jeopardy. Among the 160 nominees that are on hold, all of whom have worked to earn their promotions, all of whom we need to protect our security, include 5 three-star generals, commanders for U.S. naval forces in the Pacific and Middle East, leaders who are confronting the likes of China and Iran, and the U.S. military representative to the NATO Military Committee, which is especially important right now as Russia continues its war in Ukraine. So let me say it again. This level of obstruction of routine military promotions is a reckless departure from Senate norm. None of us want to live in a world where military appointments get routinely politicized, and that's just what the senator from Alabama is doing. He's inflicting unnecessary damage to our military leadership, and it would paralyze the Senate if all of us had to take one roll call vote after another just to confirm routine, apolitical, qualified generals and other flag officers. I know that members of both sides of the aisle feel passionately at times about certain issues. We all do. But if every one of us went to the floor and said, we're holding up every general, every admiral, every flag officer until we get our way, our military would come crashing down. It would be in shambles. And our national security would be in jeopardy. But that's just what the senator from Alabama is doing. The obstruction is dangerous, dangerous for our national security. I urge my colleague from Alabama to think about it. Why shouldn't a member on this side block military appointments? Why shouldn't any other member on that side on things they believe in just as passionately as he believes in his issue of choice? Where the proper place to take it up is on the floor of the Senate and the House as a legislative proposal, not as hostage-taking and taking hostage of our generals and admirals and people who deserve promotion. So I urge my colleagues, my Republican colleagues on the other side, to speak out and to certainly speak to the senator from Alabama and tell him how reckless this is. Several of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, to their everlasting credit, have voiced their concerns with the senator from Alabama's action. Our colleagues, our Republican leadership, should convince him to stand down and let these military promotions go through. Now, on the debt ceiling. Well, this morning, Speaker McCarthy stated in an interview that he sent a letter to President Biden demanding the two sit down to talk about debt ceiling. He's been saying that for a very long time, but for a very long time, he has not shown us any plan. To date, Speaker McCarthy has failed to unite his conference behind a single proposal that can win 218 votes. We're hearing a lot of contradictions, U-turns, by the Republican caucus in the House. Lots of outlandish proposals that would harm a lot of Americans. But as far as a plan goes, the Republican leadership still has none. When the Speaker is asked about specifics for his plan, all we get is crickets. All we get is crickets. Republicans have been flailing. One day there's a term sheet, then there's having a budget, then there's not having a budget. Now there's a supposed amorphous $4 trillion number, but the only thing missing is a real plan. You can't just pick a number out of the sky and say this is a plan. Of course it's not. You can't put just a number on the floor of the House and try to get it to pass. So when Speaker McCarthy points fingers at Democrats, all he is doing is deflecting from problems he has in his own conference. That those on the MAGA right want to pull one way, And those who are more mainstream want to pull another way, and he can't bring the two of them together. Speaker McCarthy says he wants to sit down with the president. But if he comes to the president's office with no specific plan, no specific details about what the Republicans want to cut, what are they going to talk about? The weather? If the two sit down, the Speaker would have nothing to say, because for 3 months he's been missing the one thing that he needs most, an initial plan that cannot unite 200 of his 18 votes. We Democrats have had a plan. House, Senate, Democrats. Pass it without brinksmanship, without hostage-taking. Do what we've done under President Trump and President Biden in the past when we've reached the limit of debt ceiling. So, we say to Speaker McCarthy, where's your plan? If you sit down with the president, if the two were to sit down, the Speaker would have nothing to say, because for 3 months he is missing an initial plan that can unite 218 votes. During today's interview, the Speaker also claimed multiple times that his party is considering $4 trillion in cuts. Great. Fill out the specifics where the $4 trillion exactly comes from. Put it on the floor, Mr. Speaker. Show us the plan. Have a vote. We need specifics. You can't say you're for $4 trillion in cuts if you can't point to specifics. If Speaker truly has a proposal, he should lay it out. This isn't about some amorphous, vague number. It's about having a plan. And this is the central problem with Speaker McCarthy's approach. It's not even possible to meet with the president and have a true meeting if he can't guarantee he will keep his conference together. That's why Republicans should drop their brinksmanship, drop the hostage-taking, work with Democrats on a clean, bipartisan extension of the debt ceiling, and remove this cloud that's hanging over our economy that is imposed by Speaker McCarthy's brinksmanship. On H.R. 1, the House is expected to vote this week on Republicans' partisan, unserious so-called energy package they call H.R. 1. All it takes is a brief glance at H.R. 1 to realize it's just a big giveaway to big oil, pretending to be an energy package. House Republicans' so-called energy package would gut important environmental safeguards on fossil fuel projects. It would lock America into expensive, erratic, and dirty energy sources while setting us back more than a decade on our transition to clean energy. Everyone admits we got to do something about the carbon that's causing global warming. We've seen all the changes that it's caused all across the country. And they want to move back 10 years at the behest of big oil. So it's a plan that has no support with the American people, very little. The oil interests, yes, just about nobody else. And it falls woefully short on long overdue and much needed reforms for accelerating the construction of transmission to bring clean energy projects online. Transmission is hugely important to increasing access on clean energy, but the Republican plan falls woefully short on this front as well. So I want to make clear that H.R. 1 is dead on arrival in the Senate. It's another exercise. You can go back to the MAGA supporters back home, the big oil companies who you are walking in lockstep with, and say, see, we put this on the floor, but it's not going to get anything done. We are not going to waste our time on a bill that sets America back decades in our transition to clean energy. A serious clean energy package would help ease America's transition to clean energy while ensuring that clean energy is reliable, accessible, and most importantly, affordable. Fortunately, many Democrats and Republicans understand that we need a bipartisan, bicameral approach to produce a serious energy package. Everyone knows there's going to have to be give on both sides to get it done. And we, on our side, will continue working in good faith on real permitting reform talks. But House Republicans' H.R. 1 is very simply put a non-starter. On student debt, CRA. Yesterday, Republicans introduced legislation that would end the pause on payments and overturn President Biden's historic student loan debt relief program, denying the millions of Americans with student debt the critical relief they need. Republicans talk a big game about helping working families, But they are once again showing how callous and uncaring they are by blocking that relief that would immediately improve the lives of millions of families burdened with student debt. Republicans call President Biden's plan a giveaway to high earners. That's just false. That's just malicious. That's just nasty. Under President Biden's plan, nearly 90% of relief dollars would go to out-of-school borrowers making less than $75,000. Republicans look at the facts. Let me repeat it. Under President Biden's plan, 90%, nearly 90% of debt relief dollars would go to out-of-school borrowers making less than $75,000 a year. Under President Biden's plan, no one in the top 5% of incomes will receive a penny in debt relief. President Biden's plan is not a giveaway to high earners. In fact, it's a lot of very, very wealthy people who never want to see the government help anybody except themselves who seem to push this idea of getting rid of the president's plan. President Biden's plan is a ladder up to the middle class for millions of Americans who need it most. Rather than help the privileged few, the Biden plan would benefit students of color, poor Americans, children of immigrants, and working and middle-class families across the country. These are the Americans that bear the brunt of the student debt crisis. They are the ones hurt by Republican legislation. I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
On default. Yesterday afternoon, I met with President Biden, Speaker McCarthy, Leader McConnell, and Leader Jeffries at the White House to discuss how we can take default off the table while making separate progress on an annual budget. There was bad news and good news coming out of yesterday's White House meeting. The bad news, Speaker McCarthy refused, absolutely refused, to take default off the table. He was the only holdout during yesterday's meeting. President Biden said that no matter what, default should be taken off the table. Leader Jeffries said default is off the table. I committed to taking default off the table. Even Leader McConnell said unequivocally that no matter what, the U.S. will not default. But Speaker McCarthy alone, refused to take the threat of catastrophic default off the table. I asked him pointedly if he would join us. But during yesterday's meeting, he was the sole holdout. Instead of taking default off the table, Speaker McCarthy is taking default hostage. If anyone wonders what the biggest problem for avoiding default right now is, it is Speaker McCarthy insisting he'll exploit default to push a hard right agenda. Speaker McCarthy realizes his hard right agenda would never become law on its own because the American people are so opposed. So instead, he is holding the country hostage to default. It is dangerous. It is reckless. Avoiding default should not be contingent on passing the GOP's hard right partisan agenda. And the American people overwhelmingly agree. A recent Washington Post ABC poll found that when Americans were asked if debt limit and federal spending should be handled separately or together, 58% of Americans believe they should be handled separately, just as we are saying, just as President Biden is saying. Only 26% of Americans say they should be linked, as Speaker McCarthy is proposing to do. Even 46% of Republicans said it should be handled separately. A plurality of Republicans, 46-40, is against what McCarthy is doing by tying the two together. Americans realize how dangerous this is. So again, avoiding default should not be contingent on passing the GOP's hard right agenda. Certainly not one that will make drastic cuts to veterans, to health care services, run a buzzsaw through federal law enforcement, and abandon our seniors and working families. What's more, the GOP's extremist bill is riddled with unrelated hard right policies. It would gut rules for corporations, hollow out environmental law, and cut health care for millions of our nation's most vulnerable. The cherry on top, not much of a cherry, sour cherry, MAGA Republicans want to undo Democrats' marquee legislation to invest in America, advance energy security, and reduce the deficit. That is the agenda Speaker McCarthy believes is worth threatening default. Now, the good news. The good news is that President Biden has asked the 4 leaders in our teams to sit down and begin talking about where we can agree on budget and appropriations. Our staffs will be having conversations beginning today that are part of the regular appropriations process. Now, Speaker McCarthy will have plenty of say over the budget in the appropriations process. That is the proper place to have these debates, not during conversations about the full faith and credit of the United States. When President Trump was in office and I was minority leader, I hated the Trump tax cuts on the rich and what it did to my state and my country. I could have easily said, I am holding default hostage unless we repeal the Trump tax cuts, unless we undo the Republican signature issue. But of course I didn't do that because I knew the consequences of default would be too severe. But Speaker McCarthy is doing the same thing. He is taking our signature issue, one of the leading ones, the IRA, and holding it hostage, saying he is tying it to default. So, again, Speaker McCarthy must commit to taking default off the table, and we will continue to have a separate conversation with Republicans about the budget. And as I said, and as everyone knows, the Speaker has plenty of say over the appropriations process. He won't be left out. And if the Speaker wants to be honest, by the way, about the drivers of debt, he should take a cold, hard look at the damage caused by Republican tax cuts. Next week, the Senate Budget Committee, led by Chairman Whitehouse, will hold a hearing focused precisely on how GOP cuts have been primarily responsible for increasing the debt to GDP ratio. I thank Chairman Whitehouse and members of the committee for their continued work on exposing the GOP's destructive policies. The committee will make it clear much of the debt came at the insistence of Republican President, the Republican senators, the Republican House members. But only now, with the Democratic president, does McCarthy do this awful, awful, dangerous gambit of holding the deficit, the debt, rather, the default, holding default hostage. I urge the Speaker and my Republican colleagues to come to their senses about avoiding default. Mr. Speaker, you're standing alone in that meeting. Take the needless, reckless threat of default off the table. Time is of the essence, and there's nothing stopping us from coming together in a bipartisan way, as we regularly have, to ensure that America can continue to pay its bills.
Majority Leader.
Yesterday afternoon, Treasury Secretary Yellen released a letter updating congressional leadership about their latest forecast regarding default. The Treasury's projection remains unchanged. The federal government is in danger of failing to pay its bills as soon as June 1st. Since last week's White House meeting, Democrat staff have in good faith held conversations with our Republican counterparts about the nation's fiscal future. The talks are separate but simultaneous to our responsibility to avoid default. Democrats will not use the threat of default to get what we want. Nobody should use default as a hostage. Nobody should say, unless you do this, then we default, because the consequences of default would be devastating for ordinary Americans. We talked through the weekend, we talked yesterday, and both sides, the staffs that is, are talking today as well. And later this afternoon, I will join President Biden, House Leader Jeffries, Speaker McCarthy, Leader McConnell at the White House. Democrats welcome a debate about this year's budget. For decades, both parties have regularly worked out their differences about spending and revenues throughout the appropriations process. That's what's happening right now. while we separately but simultaneously work to avoid default. And again, let me just repeat this because it's so important as we get closer to June 1st. Nobody should use default as a hostage. Nobody should say, unless you do this, then we default, because the consequences will be devastating for America. Default would almost certainly create another recession, kill more than 8 million jobs, send costs soaring on everything from mortgages, car payments, student loans, small business loans, and so much more. If you want to own a home one day, default would take that dream and run it through the shredder. If you want to protect your 401k, default would rob you of your livelihood. If you want to grow your small business or borrow student loans, or if you benefit from Social Security or Medicare, a default would be a nightmare scenario. We all know these things are fast approaching the closer we get to June 1st. Congress cannot, under any circumstances, fail its obligation to protect the full faith and credit of the United States. It is one of our highest obligations. Now on nominations and Senate business. Last night, we filed cloture on 3 more outstanding judicial nominees, 2 district court judges and a circuit court judge. Even as Senate Democrats proceed on our agenda to help working and middle-class families avoid default, we will not relent on filling the vacancies in our federal judiciary with qualified, mainstream, and diverse judges. Yesterday, we took a big step forward towards strengthening the bench with historic confirmation of Bradley Garcia, the first Latino ever to serve on the D.C. Circuit, the second most important court in the land. And the 3 judges we filed cloture on last night continue that effort. They are highly qualified and diverse candidates, both demographically and professionally. They will strengthen our federal judiciary and help the bench better reflect the diversity and dynamism of our country. Senate Democrats are going to keep working this week to advance these nominees, and I hope both sides can work together to move the process along quickly and in a bipartisan way. Today, the Senate is also busy off the floor. As we speak, the Senate Banking Committee is holding a very important hearing testimony from the former CEO and chairman of Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank to examine the failures that led to their collapses. I want to thank Chairman Brown and all the members of the committee for holding this important hearing, because we need to get to the bottom of what went wrong with SVB and Signature Bank. The American people must have confidence that Congress can work across the aisle to hold bad actors in banking accountable. And that's why it's essential we hear directly from the CEOs of the failed institutions. I hope today's hearing brings us one step closer to bipartisan action on common sense banking oversight legislation that Americans rightfully demand. I yield the floor. Note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
This morning, as the nation celebrates Pride Month, the Biden administration announced a series of new federal actions to protect our LGBTQ+ communities from threats to their rights and their safety. Over a dozen states escalate their attacks against these communities, and the administration, as over a dozen states escalate their attacks against LGBTQ communities, the administration is responding. Today's announcement includes new community safety partnerships, initiatives to support the LGBTQI+ children and their mental health, and a dedicated response to the truly Orwellian trend of banning books across the country. So I commend the Biden administration for taking these actions to protect the communities and affirming that all Americans deserve equal protection under the law and in this country. I yield the floor. Note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
And finally, on the Republican tax plan. Yesterday, the Republican-led House Ways and Means Committee advanced a sweeping array of new tax giveaways that reward the wealthy and well-connected and leave ordinary families out to dry. With this latest GOP tax scam, Republicans are showing exactly where their priorities lie, with large corporations, big oil polluters, and ultra-high-earning households. After the Trump tax law blew a nearly $2 trillion hole in our national deficit, this new Republican proposal would increase the deficit by another $1 trillion. This hypocrisy, Mr. President, is just astounding. We were 2 weeks, 3 weeks ago, we were hearing, well, we got to reduce the deficit. Debt is our big problem. We should even default before we would deal with that problem. And now, all of a sudden, they pass a bill that increases the deficit by another $1 trillion. The hypocrisy of that is bouncing around the walls here. How do they look themselves in the mirror? How do they look themselves in the mirror? By bringing us to the brink of default because they wanted the deficit down and debt down and now increase it by $1 trillion simply to help their ultra-rich friends and the biggest, wealthiest corporations who don't pay a fair share of taxes. Republicans push our country to the brink of default in the name of fiscal responsibility and deficit reduction. But now the same Republicans want to blow $1 trillion hole into the deficit without so much as batting an eye. You know what it shows you? That those Republicans, not all, but them, it shows you they really don't care about the deficit. They simply resent the idea of making the ultra, ultra wealthy and the biggest corporations pay their fair share. The Republicans' latest tax scam is also bad news for anyone worries about protecting our planet in future generations. Their proposal would gut billions in clean energy investments that are already creating millions of good-paying green jobs. Our Inflation Reduction Act has helped create over 142,000 new good-paying jobs. And more are coming, many more, in the next few years. But Republicans now want to gut those investments completely. Why? Big oil. Big oil. They'd get a $10 billion tax break under the Republican plan, and we all know that the Republican Party in the House and in the Senate is under the thumb of big oil. So it's clear that this latest GOP tax scam is more of the same. Giveaways to large corporations, giveaways to big oil, and another massive hole in the deficit. I yield the floor. Mr. President, America's tragic epidemic of gun violence has been made worse by easy access to pistol braces. But today, amazingly enough, with all of these mass shootings, Republicans want to loosen safety rules regarding these accessories and take us backward in the fight against gun violence. It's hard to believe, but that is what's happening. Pistol braces make it easier to conceal and transport weapons that function as highly dangerous short-barreled rifles, and in many instances have been accessories of choice in recent mass shootings. Some of these mass shooters choose these braces to cause mayhem, and we're loosening the rules on them. It's hard to believe our Republican friends are doing this. How on earth can Republicans look at our nation's gun violence and think the right answer is to make these accessories easier to own? How can Republicans look away from tragedies in Dayton, in Boulder, and in Nashville, and in so many other places where pistol braces were involved, and conclude we should reverse common sense gun safety rules? It makes it, when you use a pistol brace, if you're up to bad purpose, it makes it easier to conceal a weapon with AR-15-like power. Today's Republicans push to reverse safeguards against deadly pistol braces is an insult to families torn apart by these accessories. I think it's in my mind almost every day when the shootings occurred in Tennessee and the shooter used a pistol brace, and 3 9-year-olds were killed as well as 3 teachers, and you saw the picture of the little girl crying on the bus leaving the school because she was so frightened. I think of that picture every day. This proposal would mark a horrible, horrible step backward in America's fight against gun violence. I urge my colleagues, I hope on both sides of the aisle, to vote no. Ask for the yeas and nays. On appropriations. Off the floor, our appropriators continue to make good progress on the appropriations bill. This morning, the Appropriations Committee is marking up the remaining 4 appropriation bills. It's just like the NDAA. Both sides, Democrats, Republicans, have been working really well together. This is never an easy process, but I really want to thank Chair Murray and Vice Chair Collins. They have worked together in a really supremely bipartisan, almost exquisite way for shepherding these bills through committee with bipartisan support, because it ain't easy in this time of divided, when the country is so divided. This is a model for how appropriations processes should always work. Both sides coming together, finding common ground, and advancing bills that invest in American families, keep communities safe, drive down our costs, and keep our government open. It's this type of bipartisanship that has prevented any government shutdowns last Congress, when Democrats had majorities in the House and Senate. And the American people certainly don't want to see a shutdown now. So there's a lot of work left to do, but I'm pleased that our appropriators are making progress on these markups, and I thank them again. You look at the NDAA bill, you look at the appropriations bill, you compare the House to the Senate, the contrast, as I said, is glaring, and House Republicans should look to the Senate for how to really get things done and help the American people, instead of just shouting partisan screeds. Now, Mr. President, today the Senate will continue to process the National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA. I believe we've had a really good process so far, and I hope this bipartisan work can get us through to finish soon as possible. We've made good progress on amendments last night. It took a while, but we have voted on 19 amendments to the NDAA and have at least 8 more amendment votes lined up for today. We have a lot of votes to get through. So I urge senators, I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to be cooperative, to remain in the Senate chamber as the series of votes progresses through the afternoon, so we can keep the process moving. Last night, we ran a hotline that includes a few additional votes and a manager's package of 48 amendments, 23 from Democrats, 23 from Republicans, and 2 bipartisan. Each side of the aisle has amendments they really want in that manager's package, and a good number of them were bipartisan. We've had an open and constructive amendment process for the NDAA with both sides working together in good faith. This is exactly how the process for the NDAA should look: bipartisan, cooperative. I want to thank all of my colleagues, particularly Senators Reid and Wicker, for their good work. I'm also proud of our first manager's package that had 51 amendments, 21 from Republicans, 21 from Democrats, and 9 bipartisan. And some of the biggest accomplishments in this bill, I'm proud to say, are broadly bipartisan, like progress on our efforts to outcompete the Chinese government. As I've been saying for weeks, passing the NDAA is a chance to show the American people how the Senate can productively work. Another really important thing that's in this bill is the Fend Off Fentanyl Act, which will help give the administration the tools it needs, including emergency powers, to stop the precursor drugs from flowing out of China. The Chinese government has done virtually nothing to help us thus far, going to Mexico, being made into fentanyl, and then being shipped to the United States to kill our children. Over 100,000 killed, 100,000 people have died of fentanyl last year. So, as I've been saying for weeks, the NDAA is a chance to show the American people the Senate can work productively on significant things they care about, as well as on national security matters, which they care about as well. It's a stark contrast. What's happening in the Senate is a stark contrast to the partisan race to the bottom we saw in the House, where House Republicans are pushing partisan legislation that has zero chance of passing. House Republicans should look to the Senate to see how things get done. We are passing important bipartisan legislation. They are throwing on the floor partisan legislation that has no chance of passing. The contrast is glaring. And if House Republicans would look to how we're working here in the Senate and emulate us a little more, they could be far more productive. We have every reason today to believe that we can finish the NDAA as soon as possible, and hopefully we can get it done. Madam President.
The Majority Leader.
Madam President, The lesson of the past few years has been that bipartisanship is key to getting things done in the Senate, even in these divided times. A few months ago, bipartisan majorities in both chambers passed an agreement on appropriation top lines for the fiscal year of 2024 and avoided a catastrophic default, which would have been so damaging to America. Since then, Senate appropriators, led by Chair Patty Murray and Vice Chair Susan Collins, have drafted legislation honoring this bipartisan agreement. It took months of work and a lot of compromise, but all 12 appropriation bills have made it through the committee, all of them bipartisan, and many with unanimous support. Nobody got everything they wanted, but disagreements did not stymie progress. So again, bipartisanship is getting things done. That's been proven over and over again in recent years. But the reverse is also true. When a small band of senators chooses partisanship over progress, when they mimic the chaos of the House Freedom Caucus, it threatens the good work of this chamber. That's what happened last Thursday, when one senator's objections prevented us from moving forward with the appropriations process. One member, mimicking the House Freedom Caucus, has derailed the Senate and prevented us from considering amendments, including Republican amendments. It's a reminder that in both chambers, a small band of hard-right Republicans are dead set on grinding down the gears of government. For these MAGA Republicans, it's as if gridlock is a virtue and cooperation a crime. I asked this small group of Senate Republicans, what happened to wanting to do appropriation bills regular order? We said we would allow amendments. We have put a minibus on the floor with the cooperation and guidance of Senate Republican appropriators. These stunts by this very small band only serve to undermine regular order in the first place and fly in the face of what our Republican colleagues asked us to do. That is the danger of MAGA extremism. It is incapable of governing. It only produces chaos. It is so bad that last week MAGA extremists in the House prevented even a defense bill from moving forward. It's a scary pattern we're seeing emerge with some on the hard right. Extremism at all costs, even at the cost of our national defense. I urge my Republican colleagues to resist and reject these hardline attempts to derail the Senate's work. A great majority of senators from both parties want to see us move forward. In the coming days, I'll work with my colleagues on getting the appropriations process back on track so we can finish processing these appropriation bills and get us one step closer to funding the government. Because we all know if the government shuts down, it will hurt millions and millions and millions of Americans who did nothing wrong. The CR, September 30th is only 12 days away. If bipartisanship is allowed to work, we can avoid a government shutdown before then. Sadly, things in the House are not off to a good start. Last night, House GOP members released what they called a deal for a CR, but in reality reads like a hard right screed. Instead of working with Democrats to keep government open, House Republicans want to cut virtually all non-defense spending by a devastating 8%. 8%. 8% cuts to law enforcement, cancer research, and other critical priorities. Not one penny is dedicated to the president's disaster relief request, despite the anguish in so many states. No health extenders are included. No attempt to reauthorize the FAA. And with no Ukraine funding, the proposal is an insult to Ukraine and a gift to Putin. I cannot think of a worse welcome for President Zelensky, who visits us this week, than this House proposal, which ignores Ukraine entirely. Last night's proposal in the House can be boiled down to two words: slapdash, reckless. Slapdash because it's not a serious proposal for avoiding a shutdown, and reckless because if passed, it would cause immense harm to so many priorities that help the American people. Again, this Freedom Caucus wish list is not a serious proposal for avoiding a government shutdown, and if passed, would never have enough votes to make it through the Senate. To his credit, the Speaker knows a shutdown would be a terrible outcome. When I spoke with him in late July, we had a very encouraging conversation about the need for bipartisanship to avoid a shutdown. We both recognized that a bipartisan CR would be the way forward. 2 months later, a bipartisan CR is still the only answer for avoiding a government shutdown. I urge Speaker McCarthy, as well as reasonable House Republicans, to resist the 30 or so extremists within their ranks who seem dead set on provoking a crisis. The House Freedom Caucus cannot be allowed to bully the rest of the House into submission, as hard as they might try. Time is short to finish the job. If both sides embrace bipartisanship, a shutdown will be avoided. If the hard right is given a license to run the show, a shutdown is almost inevitable. It's that simple. Then there's Ukraine, which the House GOP bill completely abandons. At the very same time that President Zelensky comes to the United States to make the case for standing firm against Putin, the Republican leadership in the House of Representatives is essentially telling him, you're on your own. Nothing would make Putin happier right now than to see the United States waver in our support for the Ukrainian people. Nothing would make Putin happier. Providing aid is not just a matter of Ukrainian security, but of American security too. Because a victorious Putin would be an emboldened Putin, and that would make the world less safe for democracy and for America. For MAGA House Republicans to oppose Ukrainian aid is a terrible, dangerous mistake that could come back to haunt U.S. security. Ukrainian aid could have been an opportunity for bipartisanship, but the hard right, against what I imagine is the majority of Republicans in the House, has prevented that from happening too. So let me say it again. The House package is slapdash, reckless, and cruel, and everyone knows it has no chance of passing the Senate. The more time House Republicans waste trying to pass this MAGA wish list while ignoring chances for real bipartisanship, the greater the odds they will push us into a costly government shutdown. Mr. President, the last government shutdown lasted 35 days and began when then-President Trump said to me and Speaker Pelosi in the Oval Office, "I'm proud to shut down the government." That's what he said. In the 2 years that Democrats held the House, the Senate, and the White House, we didn't have a government shutdown. We didn't have a debt limit crisis. We didn't have the kind of chaos that we see when MAGA Republicans seem to control so much of the Republican agenda. And this year, we have already seen both. A debt limit crisis and a looming shutdown crisis just months apart. Only one thing has changed since last year, where there was none of this chaos: a House controlled by MAGA Republicans. They're back to their old ways. And of course, former President Trump is trying to add to the crisis. It's typical of what he always does, practically commanding his MAGA House sycophants to, quote, shut down the government if they can't make an appropriate deal. Absolutely. This is the problem with MAGA extremism. It's not capable of governing. It is only capable of chaos. And this year, sadly, chaos has reigned in the House. It doesn't have to be that way. It doesn't have to be a MAGA Republican-only bill. It doesn't have to be the MAGA way or a shutdown. House Republicans have a choice in the matter between pursuing real chances for bipartisanship and catering to the hard right. Each time, they have chosen to empower the hard right. They have chosen dysfunction and chaos. They have chosen to ignore bipartisanship. But what was true months ago remains true today. There is no scenario where we avoid a shutdown without bipartisanship. If Democrats tried to do it only our way, there'd be no bill. But now Republicans are trying to do it their way. Democrats are not. And there are plenty of members on both sides of the aisle who, despite our disagreements, would like to give bipartisan a chance. And that's what the American people would want us to do as well. We only have a few days left for House Republicans to come to their senses and choose the more fruitful way. I urge them to reject chaos and choose to work with Democrats. There are real people with real lives at stake here. Hundreds of thousands of federal workers all across the country could be furloughed. Services that millions of Americans count on could be disrupted. Our communities will be less safe, and our fellow Americans suffering from disasters less provided for. Those are a few of the tragic and unnecessary outcomes if the Republicans in the House let the MAGA extreme control their agenda. The matter is simple. Simple. If both sides embrace bipartisanship, a shutdown will be avoided. If House Republicans reject bipartisanship, if the hard right is given license to run the show, a MAGA shutdown will be almost inevitable.
The Majority Leader.
Now, Mr. President, we're days away from another MAGA government shutdown. Avoiding one will require the House majority to quickly accept a bipartisan solution. Yet this week, House Republicans are trying everything but bipartisanship. Everyone knows that the GOP's proposed CR is a non-starter here in the Senate. Let me say that again. Everyone knows that the House GOP's proposed CR will not pass the Senate. Because instead of even pretending to aim for bipartisanship, this bill had zero Democratic input. It calls for a crushing 8% cut to virtually all non-defense spending, 8%. The House Republican proposal, drafted and put together by the MAGA hard right wing, is slapdash, reckless, and cruel. It includes cutting investments to the Social Security Administration, to law enforcement, to nutrition assistance, to K-12 education, to small business, to rural communities, to protections for drinking water, to life-saving medical research, cancer and other research, and much more. The American people need to know just how bad this MAGA Republican CR truly is. This slapdash CR would decimate investments in life-saving research, hollowing out the National Institute of Health. This reckless CR would lower public safety, cutting back on drug and food inspection, weakening wildfire prevention, and eliminating law enforcement officers in the federal government, weakening our battle against violent crime and the scourge of fentanyl. And this cruel CR would gut investments in K-12 education, slash resources for suicide support services, upend tribal investments, and cut loans to small business and rural communities. Slapdash, reckless, cruel. That is the hallmark of this MAGA Republican proposal in the House. In order to place the bill on the calendar under the provisions of Rule 14, I would object to further proceeding.
Objection having been heard, the bill will be placed on the calendar.
Mr. President,
Majority Leader.
earlier this morning it was my distinct honor, along with Leader McConnell, to welcome Ukrainian President Zelensky to the United States. It's always a privilege to welcome a foreign head of state to the Capitol, but rarely in history have we heard directly from a leader who is fighting for his country's survival and fighting to preserve the idea of democracy. I told the members that right now this courageous man is at the fulcrum of democracy and freedom. And my message to President Zelensky and to my colleagues was simple. America must always stand with our friends around the world, and that includes the people of Ukraine. President Zelensky could not have arrived at a more crucial moment for his country and for Congress. Right now, Ukraine is engaged in a major counteroffensive against Putin's forces to reclaim their own territory and turn the tide of their bloody and brutal conflict. But it is also a moment for Congress, too. It's very clear that if we were to have a government shutdown or pass a CR without Ukrainian aid, the damage that would would occur on Ukraine's campaign would be devastating. In fact, to quote President Zelensky in the room, and this is a quote, he said, "If we don't get the aid, we will lose the war." That's a quote from President Volodymyr Zelensky. That's how stark the issue is. Nothing would make Putin happier right now than to see the United States waver in our support for the Ukrainian people. This is not just about Ukrainian security, but as President Zelensky reminded us, it's about American security as well, because a victorious Putin would be an emboldened Putin. What is the point of cutting off support now when we're at a turning point in the war, when we've invested a large amount of resources to get to this turning point? To be sure, there are some on the hard right who say we should abandon Ukraine and negotiate with Putin. It's ironic that the hard right, which historically opposed communism, now openly flirts with autocrats like Putin. Giving Putin what he wants, for America to abandon Ukraine, that is what Putin wants, would be a terrible, terrible mistake, and one, I think, that would come back to haunt us more rapidly and quickly than people believe. Now is not the time to take our foot off the gas when it comes to helping Ukraine. Turning our backs would make the world less safe for American democracy. I commend President Zelensky for his leadership during this unprecedented moment in his country's history. I thank him for his visit. I thank him for his courage. I thank him for his steadfastness. And I will keep working to ensure we continue supporting the Ukrainian people. On the CR, an ominous case of deja vu is playing out this week in the House of Representatives. A national crisis is around the corner. The solution demands bipartisanship, but Speaker McCarthy is wasting precious time catering to the hard MAGA right. Catering to the hard right didn't work during the default crisis, and it will not work here in the shutdown crisis. It's been a troublesome, vexing week for the House of Representatives. A few days ago, House Republicans released what they called a deal on a CR, but which in reality read like a House Freedom Caucus screed. It called for a devastating 8% cut on virtually all non-defense spending. It would have gutted law enforcement funding, border protection, nutrition benefits, so much more. But that still wasn't extreme enough for MAGA Republicans. The House GOP's latest proposals are even more extreme, call for even greater cuts, and stand even less of a chance of passing the U.S. Senate. House Republicans are still trying to appease the most hard-right elements of their conference. It's almost as if a small handful are deciding what the whole body of 435 members should do. It makes no sense. And the hard right, many of them, publicly say they want the government to shut down, despite the fact that it would hurt so many. And so, that's what it seems the Republican leadership is doing. Instead of pursuing the one path we all know will work, bipartisanship. Instead of decreasing the chances of a shutdown, Speaker McCarthy is actually increasing it by wasting time on extremist proposals that everyone knows he knows cannot become law. Let me say that again. Instead of decreasing the chance of a shutdown, Speaker McCarthy is actually increasing it by wasting time on extremist proposals that cannot become law. In the Senate, many of us are united in the need for more Ukraine aid, but the hard-right proposals in the House fail to provide any. In the Senate, only an agreement that can get votes from both parties will be able to pass. But the hard-right proposals have all been drafted with zero Democratic input and zero effort to even appear bipartisan. So, for all the effort Speaker McCarthy has spent on trying to find something that makes MAGA Republicans happy, there's no scenario where we avoid a shutdown without a bipartisan agreement. If the Speaker continues down on the path he's on, the odds of a shutdown sadly go up, and Americans will know that the responsibility of a shutdown will be on the Republicans' hands. Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
I ask unanimous, no quorum. Thank you. Mr. President, As I've said for months, the only solution for avoiding a harmful government shutdown is bipartisanship. We now have 4 days to go until funding expires on Saturday at midnight. We are now right at the precipice. Yet all last week, Speaker McCarthy, instead of focusing on bipartisanship, catered to the hard right and has nothing to show for it. And now the Speaker will put on the floor hard right appropriation bills that have nothing to do with avoiding a shutdown. So this week, the Senate will move forward first. Over the weekend, Senate Democrats and Republicans together worked in good faith to reach an agreement on a continuing resolution that will keep the government open beyond September 30th. We are very close to finishing our work and hope to release text very soon. This bipartisan CR is a temporary solution, a bridge towards cooperation and away from extremism, and it will allow us to keep working to fully fund the federal government and spare American families the pain of a shutdown. While for sure this bill does not have everything either side wants, it will continue to fund the government at present levels, while maintaining our commitment to Ukraine's security and humanitarian needs, while also ensuring those impacted by natural disasters across the country begin to get the resources they need. In a few hours, we'll hold the first procedural vote to move forward on the vehicle for this CR. And I thank my colleagues and staff from both sides of the aisle who spent all weekend negotiating in good faith to get us to this point. The Senate CR is a good, sensible, and bipartisan, let me emphasize, bipartisan bill. It will achieve the most important immediate goal, avoiding a shutdown. Will protect American families from needless pain, pay our troops, and make good on our promise to American seniors. It will promote access to affordable health care, sustain investment in life-saving research, and avoid costly disruptions to our supply chains. Now, of course, today's agreement won't have everything that both sides want. But let me repeat, this CR is a bridge, not a final destination. It will help us achieve our immediate and necessary goal of avoiding a government shutdown and move us away from the senseless and aimless extremism that has dominated the House, so we can get to work on appropriations. We can and must do more to respond to disasters that have ravaged the country. We can and must do more to lower costs and grow the middle class. We can and must do more to stand with our friends in Ukraine and resist Putin's dangerous attacks on democracy and freedom. And we can and must do more to finish the bipartisan appropriations process in a way that makes strong investments in our country, in our families, and in our future. We'll continue to work on these and all more, and many more. But right now, this CR is a must-needed bridge away from extremism and towards cooperation. Make no mistake, a shutdown would be a terrible outcome for the country, despite what some on the hard right would have us ludicrously believe. It's hard for me to believe that some, the extreme right in the other chamber, say they actually want a shutdown. What insanity. This will avoid that terrible outcome. It'll pay for our service members, which could be halted if there's a shutdown. It would prevent millions of Americans who count on government services from suffering. It would prevent food safety, public health protection, small business loans, infrastructure projects from being cut and at least temporarily ended, because they're all at risk right now if there's a shutdown. If there's a shutdown, TSA could be thrown into chaos, meaning possible delays and disruptions for all flyers. Border enforcement agencies would be undermined, and even FEMA's disaster relief fund could actually dry up. We don't need to go through any of this, Mr. President. The Senate's bipartisan CR will ensure that none of the bad things that I've just enumerated happen. I urge strongly reasonable members of both chambers to come together to pass this bridge CR and move forward, freed from the hard-right extremists who are hell-bent on destroying trust in government and hurting millions and millions of middle-class families. Thanks to two words: tech hubs. I spent the day traveling across upstate New York, sharing the great news that the Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse, and the Binghamton region just won prestigious tech hub designations that I created in our CHIPS and Science Act. This announcement means one thing: more good-paying, long-lasting jobs are coming to upstate New York, an area that's seen so many companies leave over the last 3-4 decades. Yesterday's Tech Hub celebration was something I've been working hard towards for a very long time. When I was writing the Tech Hubs program with Senator Young into our Bipartisan Endless Frontiers Act and then into the CHIPS and Science Act, I had upstate New York in mind. And now, thanks to this new designation, communities and cities across upstate are facing an awakening. The region is now primed to become a global hub for workforce training, innovation, and semiconductor manufacturing. But it's not just upstate New York that's affected. It's a metaphor for the whole country. There are 2 tech hubs in New York and 30 others around the country, from coast to coast in red states and blue states. And when I talked about tech hubs for cities like Rochester and Buffalo and Syracuse and Binghamton, my colleague and friend on the Republican side, Todd Young, was talking about tech hubs in his state of Indiana, in places like Indianapolis and South Bend and Fort Wayne. The whole idea is this, Mr. President. The tech industry has gravitated to a few large cities, my own city of New York, which is greatly benefiting, San Francisco, Boston, Austin, Los Angeles. But there's a load of talent in the rest of the country. It's just that no one paid attention to these places. That's the idea of tech hubs. There were 400 applications for tech hubs across the country. And the Department of Commerce, and I salute Secretary Raimondo, was very careful in picking the places where it could actually work. And that's why there are 30. So this is a great thing. And it will spread, it will take advantage of the talent that already exists in the companies and universities and individuals and schools in the heartland of the country, not just on the coasts, and give them a real chance to take part and create tens of thousands, millions of good-paying jobs in every part of the country. So I was really proud of the Tech Hubs proposal, and it's going to continue. We're going to put more funding into it. We're going to do everything we can to help tech hubs grow and help America grow and stay #1 in the world. Because when we invest in high-end in science and high-end manufacturing and research, everybody benefits. So this is good news. In red states, in blue states, Secretary Raimondo didn't look around and just say, oh, we can only do blue states, like Donald Trump might have done. She's put them in all the places that there can be new help. So let's look at the contrast here, folks. While House Republicans struggle to even select a speaker, these tech hub announcements show that President Biden and Democrats are delivering, putting tens of thousands of people to work in good-paying jobs, opening new plants and factories, and securing American leadership in the technologies of tomorrow. Not in a very long time has the contrast between the parties been as glaring as today. When Democrats lead the way, Americans see more jobs, more manufacturing, lower costs. When Republicans are in charge, right-wing Republicans, not all of them, but the right wing seems to be running the show, these MAGA Republicans, it leads to paralysis, chaos, and extremism. No matter how the GOP impasse in the House is resolved, we will not change our focus as Democrats. We will create more jobs, work to lower costs, and do it on a bipartisan basis wherever we can. I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum. I would say to my colleagues in the House, my Republican colleagues, if you try to do things not in a bipartisan way, it's going to lead to cul-de-sacs, gridlocks, and other things that hurt the American people. Both parties recognize we must support our allies in Israel against Hamas. Both parties recognize that we must support our friends in Ukraine against Putin. Both parties know that we must fight the scourge of fentanyl coming through the border, outcompete the Chinese government, and support Taiwan. So to my Republican colleagues, House and Senate, let's work together to ensure that passing the supplemental remains bipartisan, because only things that win support from both sides will make it to the President's desk. I thank my colleagues on both sides who have shown that bipartisanship is still the key to getting things done here in the Senate. And now, because of that bipartisanship, the appropriations process is finally moving forward. On our AI Insight Forum, on the business of today. Today, the Senate Appropriations Committee hears testimony from the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of State on President Biden's emergency supplemental request sent to Congress to address the national security threats happening around the world. The right path forward for Congress is clear. We must stand with our allies in Israel. We must send humanitarian aid to innocent civilians in Gaza. We must give aid to Ukraine and hold the line against Vladimir Putin. And we must rebuff the aggressions of the Chinese Communist Party in the Indo-Pacific. As has been true from the start of this Congress, bipartisan cooperation will be the only way anything gets to the President's desk. So I'm deeply troubled that yesterday, House Republicans released a partisan and woefully inadequate package with no aid to Ukraine, no humanitarian assistance for Gaza, no funding for the Indo-Pacific, and, in addition, poison pills that increase the deficit and help wealthy tax cheats avoid paying their fair share. The House GOP bill is woefully inadequate and has the hard right's fingerprints all over it. It makes aid for Israel, who has just faced the worst terrorist attack in its history, contingent on poison pills that reward rich tax cheats. In short, it makes it much, much harder to pass aid for Israel. It's insulting that the hard right is openly trying to exploit the crisis in Israel to try and reward the ultra-rich. The new Speaker knows perfectly well that if you want to help Israel, you can't propose legislation that is full of poison pills. And this kind of unnecessarily partisan legislation sends the wrong message to our allies and adversaries around the world. It's almost as if the real goal of this House GOP package is not to help Israel, but to get tax relief for the super wealthy, while leaving out Ukraine aid, leaving out humanitarian aid for Gaza, leaving out funding for the Indo-Pacific. Instead of advancing a serious proposal to defend Israel, defend Ukraine, and provide humanitarian aid, this House GOP proposal, let me say that again, instead of advancing a serious proposal to defend Israel, defend Ukraine, and provide humanitarian aid, this House GOP proposal is clearly designed to divide Congress on a partisan basis, not unite it. The Speaker's allies have said as much to the press. I hope the new Speaker realizes that this is a grave mistake and quickly changes course. To protect Americans against any one of these foreign threats, we must protect against them all. Because you can be sure that President Xi will watch what America does in Ukraine just as much as they watch what we do in Israel, in the Indo-Pacific, and everywhere else. And the last thing Republicans in Congress should be doing is exploiting the crisis in Israel to sneak a highly partisan provision that caters to the ultra-rich, as the GOP package blatantly does. As I mentioned, when I spoke to Speaker Johnson the night of his election, the only way we will get anything done is in a bipartisan way. Unfortunately, in his first major decision as Speaker, Speaker Johnson has ignored that advice. Now, on a different note, across the way, yesterday a small band of MAGA extremists plunged Congress into pandemonium. For the first time in American history, a Speaker of the House of Representatives has been removed from his position at the hands of radicals that he empowered from day one. What happened yesterday is a failure entirely of the House Republicans' own doing, a disaster in the making, to the great detriment of Congress and to the detriment of the American people. Speaker Boehner, Speaker Ryan, and now Speaker McCarthy have all learned the same hard lesson. You cannot allow the hard right to run the House or the country, and all three of them were chased out by the MAGA right. You cannot allow a small band of MAGA extremists, which represent just a very small percentage of the views of the country, to tell the overwhelming majority of Americans what to do. But Republican problems with MAGA extremism seep far deeper than any single leader. MAGA extremism is a poison that the House GOP has refused to confront for years. And until the mainstream House Republicans deal with this issue, the chaos will continue. I thought House Republicans would have finally realized the dangers of MAGA extremism after what happened last fall. But year after year, they end up making the same mistake, and it always leads to disaster. By now, I hope it's obvious. MAGA extremism is not good for the House Republican leadership. It is not good for the GOP. It is not good for Congress. And MAGA extremism is disastrous for the country. If MAGA Republicans had their way, they'd take our country back all the way to the 19th century. They turn the clock back radically on women's choice, on voting rights, on workplace protections, on education, on corporate greed, on the environment. They would disfigure our precious democracy, all for a handful of greedy, very wealthy people who just want to not have anything to do with the rest of us. The MAGA agenda is a dark and dangerous vision of America, one most people overwhelmingly reject. Even so, they are the ones running the show right now in the House GOP. We find ourselves in a dangerous situation. With about 40 days to go before the government shuts down, the House has ground completely to a halt. Until Republicans stop their infighting, the House can vote on no bills, no appropriations work can get done. If, God forbid, some national crisis were to occur that demands immediate action, the House would be unable to quickly respond. So let me say this to the next Speaker of the House, whomever that may be. Think carefully about what happened to your predecessors before trying to coddle the hard right. Each of your predecessors got burnt each time. I urge the next Speaker not to make the same mistake, not just for their own future, but for the country's. Whoever the House elects as Speaker will not be able to ignore the realities of divided government, no matter what the hard right demands. The need for bipartisanship will not change. We will need bipartisanship to keep the government open. We will need it to finish the appropriations process. We will need it to make life better for the American people. For the good of the country, I urge my Republican colleagues in the House to once and for all accept that reality. If not, it is my fear, deep fear, that the chaos from yesterday is just the beginning. Now on what's going on across the way in the House. Thanks to MAGA Republicans, the U.S. House of Representatives has now been without a Speaker for 2 weeks, a paralysis in governing unprecedented in modern times. Hard-right extremists in the House have ground the People's House to a halt at the worst possible moment, at a time when our ally Israel faces its darkest hour, and the U.S. government would shut down in less than a month if we don't act. Today, the House will gavel in to try and break the impasse, though it seems like the chaos of the hard right has exposed the deep, perhaps irreparable divisions within the House GOP. No matter who becomes Speaker, one lesson remains true. Whether it's funding the government, avoiding default, or helping American families, Bipartisanship will be the only way things get done in a divided government. Bipartisanship is the only way. When there's a Democratic president, a Democratic Senate, and a Republican House, a small band of right-wing MAGA Republicans in the House cannot say it's my way or your way. You're a minority, MAGA Republicans. You're a minority in the Republican Party. You're a minority with the people of America. You're a minority in this government. Certainly, your voices will be raised and you'll want some say, but it can't be your way or no way. Bipartisanship will be required to help Israel. It will be required to avoid a government shutdown. It will be required to finish the appropriations process. Bipartisanship will be required for just about everything that happens in the Congress. So whoever the House elects as Speaker will not be able to ignore the realities of divided government, no matter what the hard right demands. As former Speakers Boehner, Ryan, and McCarthy have learned, you cannot let the hard right run the caucus, or you won't last as Speaker. And even worse, it will lead to more chaos at a time when the American people need unity and help and stability. Now on the minibus. Over the course of this week, I've worked closely with Democratic and Republican appropriators to move forward on the bipartisan Senate appropriations process. We've made a lot of progress this week, trying to reach an agreement on amendments. We're getting close to an agreement, but we're not there yet, so we'll keep working today. Here in the Senate, unlike the chaos of the House, most members on both sides want to see bipartisanship, because that's the only way things move forward in a divided government. And the Appropriations Committee, under the leadership of Chair Murray and Ranking Member Collins, have done a very good job passing out all the bills with overwhelming bipartisan majorities, many of them unanimously. But there's one crucial point, Mr. President. When we came to agreement to move these bills, both sides committed to stopping poison pill amendments, because that would risk upending the process. Sadly, a small group on the other side have tried adding poison pills, and we've been dealing with them over the last few weeks. I'm optimistic that we'll work through these poison pills and pass these bipartisan bills soon. Democrats made a commitment to our Republican colleagues to pursue regular order as much as possible because we want to get these appropriation bills done. We have committed to having debates and votes on relevant non-poison pill amendments. I think there are 39 or so lined up. But while we're getting close, the work is not done. We're going to keep working today. If people want to know why it's moving slowly, it's because of Republican insistence on poison pill amendments. But that's not going to stop us. We're going to keep moving forward, and we're going to try to vote on amendments soon. So once again, thank you to the whole Appropriations Committee on both sides. I'm optimistic we can get this done. Now on the new Speaker. Yesterday, after a month-long paralysis in Congress, House Republicans finally elected a new Speaker of the House. I spoke with Speaker Johnson last night and expressed my congratulations on his election to this speakership. I told Speaker Johnson the exact same thing I told Speaker McCarthy. In a divided government, the only way we'll avoid a shutdown, fund the government, or pass the supplemental is bipartisanship. I hope the new Speaker learns lessons from the disastrous experiences of his predecessors, Speakers Boehner, Ryan, and McCarthy, and realizes that coddling the hard right is disastrous, both for the country and for the Republican leadership. Because, like it or not, Speaker Johnson will not be able to ignore the need for bipartisanship in divided government. Right now, the world's in crisis. Americans and the citizens of the world, people across the world, are looking for a Congress that is functional, decisive, and able to reach across the aisle. We must work together to send Israel the help she needs. We must stand with our friends in Ukraine, which majorities in both chambers have made clear they support. To allow Putin to succeed is to endanger America's national security, and it's alarming that a growing number of House Republicans don't seem to care about this. We also need humanitarian aid to reduce the suffering in the Middle East in Ukraine and elsewhere. We must also finish the bipartisan appropriation process. Extremist funding bills that make cuts way below the partisan June agreement will not fly. If Speaker Johnson tries to send those cuts over here, they're not going to happen. They'll be dead on arrival. All they'll do is waste more time at a moment when every day counts. So he cannot listen to these 30 members of the hard right who somehow think they have all the knowledge and all right on their side and then tie us in a knot. Again, whether House Republicans like it or not, this is divided government. Bipartisanship is the only way we'll be able to get anything done. I hope, pray, Speaker Johnson realizes this quickly. If Speaker Johnson repeats the mistakes of Speaker McCarthy, if he tumbles down the MAGA road, it will be inevitable that the House finds itself trapped in even more chaos very soon. If Speaker Johnson lives up to the label that Congressman Gates has given him, MAGA Mike, he will fail as the previous speakers have. But if Speaker Johnson chooses the bipartisan path, we can do great things for the American people, just as we did last Congress with an evenly divided Senate and a narrowly divided House. I look forward to working constructively with Speaker Johnson and congratulate him on his election. On the CR. Mr. President, last night the House of Representatives overwhelmingly passed a temporary extension of government funding into early next year. The vote in the House was 336 to 95, with 209 Democrats and 127 Republicans voting in favor. 93 Republicans voted against it. Shortly after the vote, I moved to place the House-passed bill on the Senate's legislative calendar, and I have just filed cloture on the motion to proceed to get this process moving in the Senate. Today, my Democratic colleagues and I will work with Republicans. I will work with Leader McConnell to see if we can come to an agreement to accelerate this bill's passage. If both sides cooperate, there's no reason we can't finish this bill even as soon as today, but we're going to keep working to see what's possible. Now, the House CR's bill is the House's CR is far from perfect, but we're moving forward because we believe it accomplishes two things that I and other Democrats have been insistent on for weeks. It will avoid a government shutdown, and it will do so without any of the cruel cuts or poison pills that the hard right pushed for. I think it was very important that Speaker Johnson recognized that Democratic votes are necessary to pass anything of significance in Congress. I reminded him every time I've spoken to him that we have to work in a bipartisan way to get anything done. And if he follows the clarion call of the hard right, whose views are far away from even the mainstream of his conference, let alone the American people or the Senate, that will lead to disaster, the same problems that we saw under Speaker Boehner, Speaker Ryan, and Speaker McCarthy. Thus far, the Speaker has heeded the lesson as we finish the appropriations process. Bipartisanship is the only way forward. As he once noted, when you have a Senate that's Democratic and a President that's Democratic, a Republican House, particularly one that just follows what the hard right wants, will not get anything accomplished. Of course, this CR doesn't do everything that we want. Above all, we must finish working on President Biden's emergency supplemental request so we can send aid to Israel, provide humanitarian aid for innocent civilians in Gaza, stand with Ukraine, and provide funds for the Indo-Pacific. We'll continue to work with Leader McConnell on a way forward. We intend to move on the President's supplemental package sometime in the coming weeks. As everyone knows, the biggest holdup right now is Republicans' insistence that they'll only approve Ukraine aid in exchange for immigration items. We're going to work in the coming weeks in good faith to see if there's any possibility for a reasonable, realistic compromise that Democrats can support. To come to such a compromise, both sides will have to give. It can't be one side all the way, as when our Republican colleagues offered us basically H.R. 2, which we totally oppose and had no input into. But So I hope we can get this reasonable, realistic compromise on border done. But the bottom line is that we need to get Israel aid done, we need to get Ukraine aid done, we need to get humanitarian aid done, we need to get Indo-Pacific aid done. And linking any of these bipartisan issues to extremist positions, to extremist poison pills on immigration or any other issue would be a colossal blunder that history will look very unkindly upon. I hope we can come to a solution in the coming weeks. In the meantime, the most important order of business is to keep the government open. We'll keep working over the course of the day to fast-track the House's bipartisan CR bill. No drama, no delay, no government shutdown. That's our goal, and we hope we have an agreement very soon. To avoid a shutdown with no cuts in vital programs and no poison pills is a very good solution for the American people. Mr. President,
The Majority Leader.
I ask unanimous consent the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Now, Mr. President, before I get into my remarks this morning, I want to offer my thoughts and prayers to everyone affected by the 4-alarm fire on Main Street in Buffalo, New York, yesterday. And I want to especially offer my condolences to the Buffalo Fire Department, which lost one of its firefighters, Jason Arno, in the line of duty during this horrible tragedy. Our thoughts and prayers go out to his family as well. I want to thank all of the first responders who were on the scene. We're profoundly grateful for all you do to keep us safe every day. Now on the President's visit to our caucus lunch this afternoon. Later today, Senate Democrats will welcome President Biden to the Capitol for a special caucus lunch to talk about our agenda for the 118th Congress. I predict that today's conversation will re-emphasize a couple of important points. Unlike the other party, Democrats are united. We have a great story to tell about our work over the last 2 years, and we are ready to keep working in a bipartisan way to make life better for the American people. In the last 2 years, if the last 2 years focused on getting our agenda passed into law, one of the focuses of our lunch will be on how the next 2 years will be about implementing that agenda. Legislation must and will continue, but implementation will also be a top priority. Democrats are making sure that Americans see our agenda in their own backyards, on their way to work, and when they balance their checkbooks. Americans will see our agenda as the roads and bridges and highways they use every day finally get the fixes that are so needed. And Americans will see our agenda in action as manufacturing, good-paying manufacturing jobs, high-end jobs, returns to our shore as new innovations get developed here at home. We'll also talk with President Biden about one of the most important priorities that defines our party, building ladders to help people get into the middle class and helping people who are already in the middle class stay there. We'll continue protecting Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid from the hard right. We'll keep investing in infrastructure jobs and good-paying union jobs. And we will hold abusive corporations accountable for putting profits over people's safety. We'll also be going to make sure that once people make it into the middle class, they have the tools to stay in the middle class. That's precisely the reasoning behind our work on IRA, on CHIPS, and on science, on pushing for student debt relief and increasing Pell Grants, and so much more. I expect we'll also discuss how we'll keep Americans safe and keep democracy alive in the 21st century. 1 year into Putin's violent assault on Ukraine, the support for Ukraine will hold firm. And that, praise God, has been very bipartisan. Leader McConnell and I are united in that regard. So we'll focus on taking an all-of-the-above approach to outcompete President Xi and the Chinese Communist Party. CHIPS was an important step in that direction, but we cannot relent. The administration has already taken a few executive actions that will increase our ability to bring jobs back here and prevent the Chinese from purloining our intellectual property, but we certainly cannot rest on our laurels. Finally, very importantly, we're going to talk about how Democrats will preserve our unity in the months ahead. The story here in Congress over the first few months of 2023 has been one of contrasts. Democrats are united on helping average Americans, while the Republicans are divided, paralyzed by chaos, and so many of them doing the bidding of the ultra-rich and the very well-connected and powerful. Republicans like to talk about standing up for average folks and fighting wokeism, whatever that means. But look at what they've actually done this year. They've given cover to wealthy tax cheats, escalated their war on women, even tried to push a national sales tax that would raise taxes significantly, up to 30% for average families. How the heck is an average family going to pay 30% more for everything they buy? What planet are these folks on? Nowhere else is the contrast between Democrats and Republicans more glaring than when it comes to raising the debt ceiling. President Biden, Senate and House Democrats have been clear from the very beginning that we are united on what our plan is. Both sides must come together and raise the debt ceiling without engaging in hostage-taking, brinksmanship, or political blackmail. Speaker McCarthy, however, is unable to unite his conference or explain what exactly the Republican plan is. The hard right is demanding that we agree to spending cuts in exchange for their votes. But to this day, there is no consensus and no clarity about what cuts Republicans want. Speaker McCarthy, it's March 2nd. Where is your plan? It's March 2nd, Leader McCarthy. You've been talking about a plan for a while. Where is it? Where is your plan? You say Social Security and Medicare is off the table, but until the American people see a plan, they cannot just take the Speaker at his word that Social Security and Medicare will be safe, because so many on his right flank, so many mainstream Republican members even, have long pushed to have these programs changed. And there is more Americans have to worry about. What is the Republican plan on Medicaid, or funding the police, on Pell Grants, on defense, on food for kids? Will all these things get cut in their plan? Again, this goes back to the central problem with the Republican House majority. It will be exceedingly difficult and in all likelihood impossible for them to unite around a plan that they can pass with their 220-some-odd votes and that the American people will accept and like. This contrast, Mr. President, is going to keep growing and growing in the months ahead. During today's lunch, we'll talk with the President about how we can make sure Americans see and understand the contrast. I thank President Biden for his time, and I very much look forward to having him here at our Capitol. Now on insulin. Yesterday's news that Eli Lilly is capping insulin costs for patients at $35 a month is a very big deal. That will make an enormous difference for the millions of Americans that rely on this drug to manage their diabetes. I commend Eli Lilly for taking this much-needed step. But frankly, this should have happened a long time ago. There's no excuse for monthly insulin costing $600, $700, $800 a month and people quaking in their boots about whether they can take half a dose, a quarter of a dose, no dose at all, and get even sicker. And so we're happy to see that this company ends its terrible practice of keeping insulin prices high, and they deserve commendation. It does bring up a few other points. First, Eli Lilly's announcement is good progress, but still not close to enough. There is no substitute for legislation, such as the legislation you have been offering, Mr. President, Senator Warnock. There is no substitute for legislation that locks down a mandatory and permanent cap on insulin for all Americans, not just those who get insulin from certain companies. Second, lowering insulin costs is a good policy that everyone on both sides should get behind. This should not be a Democratic issue or a Republican issue. It's something that affects people in every city, in every state. And third, now is the time to finish the job and pass a bill to put a $35 cap on insulin for all Americans. Last year, we Democrats made good progress in the Inflation Reduction Act to lower insulin to $35 for seniors on Medicare. It is my hope to soon bring a bipartisan bill to lower prescription drug costs and cap insulin costs at $35 for everyone on the floor. everyone to the floor and pass it with support from both sides of the aisle. Let's get this done. So important for the American people. We Democrats are going to do all we can to get it done, hopefully in a bipartisan way. Finally, on Fox News, there's a lot to talk about this morning, Mr. President. Earlier this week, we learned that Rupert Murdoch admitted during a deposition that he and Fox News executives knowingly broadcasted the big lie on their network, despite many of them knowing it was completely bogus. And when asked if he could have stepped in to stop it, Mr. Murdoch claimed that he could have, but chose not to. And he expressed regret for not doing so. With all due respect, expressing regret is not enough. I repeat, expressing regret on an issue so vital to the future of our democracy is just not enough. So, when Rupert Murdoch and Fox News executives and hosts have done what they have done is dangerous. When people doubt that elections are on the level, that is the beginning of the end of this wonderful democracy. Elections are a wellspring. When people don't believe they're legit, democracy starts flying out the window and some other form of autocracy comes in. We're not there yet, but Fox News and its commentators who have lied have helped sow some evil seeds in our body politic. The wellspring of democracy is elections, and it's why this wonderful, great experiment has endured for so long. When conspiracy theories like the big lie are allowed to grow, when they are given a primetime slot on cable news, well, we all saw what could happen on January 6th. And that's why I wrote a letter with Leader Jeffries to Mr. Murdoch this week, demanding that he should do what he should have done a long time ago. First, stop spreading lies about the election. Second, stop sowing division. Third, stop weakening faith in our democracy. Fourth, stop the commentators who continue to repeat the big lie, even after so much of Fox, including Mr. Murdoch, admitted it was a lie and admitted they regretted it happened. Stop them from doing it. Again, expressing regrets is simply not enough. In the light of mounting evidence that Fox News knowingly misled their viewers, it's alarming, it's disturbing, it's highly inappropriate for Speaker McCarthy to share highly sensitive security camera footage of the January 6th attack to Tucker Carlson, one of the biggest peddlers of the big lie, one of the people who's done more to destroy faith in this democracy than just about anyone else. Releasing this footage publicly reveals the location of security cameras across the Capitol grounds, making it harder and more dangerous for our brave Capitol police officers who defended the Capitol that day to do their job. So giving someone as disingenuous, fundamentally as dishonest as Tucker Carlson when it comes to what happened in the election, giving him exclusive access to this type of sensitive information is a grave mistake by Speaker McCarthy, and feeds into the propaganda he's already put on Fox News' air. I yield the floor. Mr. President, later today, the Senate will take the first procedural step to begin consideration of our annual defense bill. For more than 6 decades, Democrats and Republicans have worked in good faith to pass the NDAA. This year's defense authorization bill is a prime example of how Senate Ds and Rs can work constructively to provide our nation's defense, take care of our service members and DoD civilians, and make the investments necessary to innovate and build up our military and intelligence capabilities. I hope we can have an open and constructive amendment process for the NDAA without needless delay or dilatory tactics. I certainly hope we do not see the kind of controversy that severely hindered the NDAA process over in the House. Both sides should defeat potentially toxic amendments and refrain from delaying the NDAA's passage. So far, we have thankfully avoided all of that. Over the weekend, nearly all the committees across the Senate worked round the clock on a substitute with a manager's package that has 51 amendments, 21 from Republicans, 21 from Democrats, and 9 bipartisan. We've had many great amendments. This is a good start, and we are working towards a second manager's package with even more priorities for Democrats and Republicans. I want to thank Chairman Reid, Ranking Member Wicker, all the other chairs and rankers, and all of my colleagues and the staff who worked long and hard over the weekend for their good work on this bill. Now, there are a few items that are in the bill that deserve some attention, and in the largeness of the bill, I'd like to highlight. I want to highlight a few items added to the manager's package that are very important and bode well for our country's future, particularly on AI, on outcompeting the Chinese government, and tackling our nation's fentanyl crisis. First, I'm pleased the manager's package includes an amendment I worked on with Senator Rounds, Young, and Heinrich that takes some early initial steps on AI legislation, the first steps this body is taking in a while. The Senate has already done important preliminary work to bring ourselves up to speed on this issue, but the NDAA will be the Senate's first opportunity this year to pass real AI legislation. My AI amendment includes provisions that will boost AI oversight within the national security space, including an increase in data sharing within the DoD, new risk studies to examine explainability in similar issues, and provide for bug bounty programs that will help sniff out vulnerability in AI systems used by the DoD. This year, our first manager's package also makes a critical down payment on the Senate's efforts to outcompete the Chinese government. We have over a dozen amendments related to our ongoing competition with the Chinese government, including measures that make progress on the AUKUS Defense Cooperation Agreement between the U.S., the U.K., and Australia. Senator Menendez and I wanted more, but we have a good compromise in the bill, and I hope we can add more in the amendment process. We have provisions to strengthen our partnership with Taiwan, boost the development of quantum information technologies, strengthen the U.S.'s position in the Indo-Pacific region, to name a few. As you know, we are working on a bipartisan China competition package that will deal with the excesses and wrongs of the Chinese government. But this, in the DoD bill, is a good first start. And I also want to praise my colleagues, Tim Scott and Sherrod Brown, for their work to combat our nation's fentanyl crisis. This is one of the most devastating health crises happening in our country. In 2021, the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, seized enough fentanyl to give every single American a lethal dose. Every single American. A lot of blame for this crisis lies at the feet of the chemical suppliers located in China that operate with little or no accountability, which represent the bedrock of the international fentanyl supply chain. I felt this is very important, that we do more to stop the scourge of fentanyl from coming into our country. And so I pushed very hard to get this amendment in the manager's package, and I'm glad it was. Championed, as I said, passed in the Banking Committee by Chairman Brown and Ranking Member Scott. It declares the international trafficking of fentanyl a national emergency and adds teeth and potential sanctions to the administration's ability to hold wrongdoers accountable. The ability to declare this a national emergency gives the president broader powers and allows him to do more to stop the flow of these precursor chemicals coming from China and other countries. The bill was passed unanimously, I'm proud to say, by the Banking Committee, another great example of regular order here in the Senate. And finally, I'm pleased the NDAA will include my amendment on increasing transparency on UAPs, or unidentified anomalous phenomena. UAPs generate a lot of curiosity for many Americans, and with that curiosity sometimes comes misinformation. So my amendment will require the National Archive and Records Administration to create a collection of records from across government agencies that can be declassified for the public's use, similar to the approach used in 1992 with the JFK Assassination Records Collection Act. These records will carry a presumption of immediate disclosure, which means they can only remain classified with good reason. I thank my colleagues who worked with me on this legislation, Senator Rounds, Rubio, Heinrich, Gillibrand, and Young for their partnership on this amendment. And as many know, my mentor and dear friend who I miss so much, Harry Reid, was passionate about this issue. And so were Senators Stevens and Inouye. So I'm glad we could get this into the manager's amendment. For these and many other reasons, I look forward to beginning floor consideration of the NDA bill today. The four things I've mentioned, dealing with fentanyl, dealing with competition with China, dealing with AI, and with making public the UAP phenomena and what we know about them in an unclassified way, are all important additions to the defense bill, and I'm glad we added them in. I thank both sides for their good work, and I hope we can pass this important bill without needless delay or controversy. Now on the Freedom to Vote Act. In just a few minutes, I'll be joining a group of my Democratic colleagues to mark the reintroduction of the Freedom to Vote Act. The Freedom to Vote Act rests on a simple yet fundamental principle. All Americans, no matter where they live, should have the freedom to vote without fear of discrimination. Our bill would set basic standards for Americans to vote safely and securely and help instill confidence that our nation's elections are free and fair. I want to thank Senators Klobuchar, Kaine, and Warnock for their good work on putting this bill together, as well as my House colleagues led by Leader Jeffries. While Democrats are actively working to expand access to the ballot box, MAGA Republicans in the House, unfortunately, are doing exactly the opposite. Last week, House Republicans introduced and advanced through committee the most restrictive voting rights package we've seen in decades. The Republican package would make voting harder for millions of Americans by creating more barriers to the ballot box, including new obstacles to voter registration and mail-in voting. The Republican package would also allow the scourge of dark money to fester in our politics by loosening campaign finance safeguards and empowering wealthy donors. So let me be clear. Let me be very clear. Democrats will never allow this Republican package to become law, and instead will focus our efforts on common sense, real voting voting rights legislation like the Freedom to Vote Act. And on nominations, later today, the Senate will confirm Rachel Blumenkatz to serve as Circuit Court Judge for the Sixth Circuit. A graduate of Harvard and UCLA Law, Ms. Blumenkatz is an accomplished litigator who has dedicated her career to the pursuit of equal justice for all. I want to note, Mr. President, that with the Blumenkatz confirmation, the Senate will have confirmed 36 Circuit Court judges to lifetime appointments under President Biden, including 27 women. These appointments are significant because the lion's share of all federal cases never actually make it to the Supreme Court and are instead resolved at the Circuit Court level. Senate Democrats have prioritized filling these vacancies with highly qualified nominees that reflect the diversity and dynamism of our country. That's the best way we can restore trust in our court, so sorely needed today. I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll. Ms. Baldwin.
Now on the supplemental. Today, the House of Representatives is scheduled to vote on the GOP's unserious and woefully inadequate aid package. By now, it's glaringly apparent that the House aid package is even worse than what people originally thought, because yesterday, the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office reported the House Republican package will add over $12 billion to the budget deficit. Now, Speaker Johnson said he wanted to pay for. He insists that emergency funding for Israel has to be paid for when we usually don't pay for emergency funding. But the hypocrisy here is that by cutting funding to go after tax cheats, he will actually explode the deficit by billions and billions of dollars. What a joke. I am glad that the President issued a veto threat over this stunningly unserious proposal. Unserious at a time of crisis like this? From the House GOP leader? The Senate will not be considering this deeply flawed proposal from the House GOP. And instead, we will work together on our own bipartisan emergency aid package that includes aid to Israel, Ukraine, competition with the Chinese government, and humanitarian aid for Gaza, so much needed. Let me say that again. The Senate will not take up the House's GOP's deeply flawed proposal, and instead will work on our own bipartisan emergency aid package that includes aid to Israel, Ukraine, competition with the Chinese government, and humanitarian aid for Gaza. It still mystifies me that at a moment when the world is in crisis, at a time when we need to help Israel respond to Hamas, the House GOP thought it was a good idea to tie Israel aid to a hard-right proposal that will raise the deficit and is totally partisan, and all the while helping wealthy tax cheats get away scot-free. Why would they make support for Israel conditional on this hard-right giveaway to the wealthy? It's truly astounding, and it shows you how weak and unserious, and what a joke, frankly, the House GOP proposal is. And don't just take it from me, folks. The Republican vice chairman of the Joint Economic Committee had this to say about the House GOP bill, and he's a member of the House GOP. He said, quote, "I think it was intellectually lazy. It's a little hard to have, quote, I care about debt, and then at the same time move something as you pay for that actually will have a multiplier of raising the debt." That's a top Republican saying this House Republican proposal will actually have a multiplier of raising the debt. I really regret that the House Speaker has chosen this as his first major legislative step. When we spoke the night he was elected, I said, let's work together in a bipartisan way. And I reminded him that things only get done if you work in a bipartisan way. Speaker Boehner, Speaker Ryan, Speaker McCarthy had to learn that lesson the hard way. I hope the Republican leader will examine what he has done and change course and work in a bipartisan way to help fund these necessary items for Israel, Ukraine, Gaza, and the South Pacific and the South China Sea. The right way forward is something very different from what the House GOP is pushing. We need to stand with Israel. We need to provide swift humanitarian aid for Gaza. We need to help Ukraine, which desperately and immediately needs the help. And we need to stay one step ahead of the Chinese government. The Senate will work on our own emergency aid package, not the one proposed by House Republicans. I yield the floor. Note the absence of quorum. The supplemental. On Monday, Speaker Johnson and House Republicans released a totally unserious and woefully inadequate package that omitted aid to Ukraine, omitted humanitarian assistance to Gaza, had no funding for the Indo-Pacific, and made funding for Israel conditional on hard-right, never-going-to-pass proposals. What a joke. Yesterday afternoon, President Biden issued a veto threat on the GOP proposal. And it's no wonder why it needlessly politicizes aid to Israel. It balloons the federal deficit. Here the House is talking about we need to pay for to reduce the deficit, and they put in a provision that actually increases the deficit. Why? Because they don't want their super rich, mega wealthy friends to be audited by the IRS like every other citizen is. As we know, when Trump was president, he almost exempted them from auditing. Someone making $40,000 a year had a greater chance of being audited than someone making $4 million a year. It's amazing that the main focus, as the world is in crisis in the Middle East, in Ukraine, in the Indo-Pacific, our House Republicans are spending more time trying to further reduce taxes of those who don't pay much tax anymore at all. So I'm so glad that President Biden issued a strong veto message. I'd urge every House Republican, every House Democrat, every Senate member to read the President's veto message. It's strong and well thought out. And he talks about it politicizing aid to Israel, it ballooning the federal deficit, and it failing to address the national security threats that America faces around the globe, particularly our need to help Ukraine, provide humanitarian aid to Gaza, and help in the Indo-Pacific. So, the House GOP proposal is not going anywhere. It's dead before it even is voted on. The Speaker should start over, this time without terrible partisan poison bills, this time sitting down with Democrats and working this issue through. Israel has suffered the worst terrorist attack in its history. It needs help. But House Republicans are asking a price for helping them by cutting off funding that holds rich tax cheats accountable. That ain't happening, House. It ain't happening. Now, Speaker Johnson says that this supposed pay is needed because of his concern about the national debt. But as I mentioned, every independent estimate shows this partisan bill raises the deficit by billions of dollars. So what hypocrisy! It's not responsible. It's reckless. It's utterly baffling that at a moment that demands maximum bipartisanship, when the country is in crisis, and our friends in Israel and Ukraine are in crisis, that the House GOP is instead trying to pick an egregiously partisan fight over wealthy tax cheats. Years back, both parties would have come together for the good of the country and the good of security in the world when crises like this happen. But the House GOP continuing the kind of recklessness, the kind of inability to get their act together, continues to do these kinds of things. The proposal is simply not a serious one, and worse, it still wastes precious time at a moment when we need to help Israel, Ukraine, and send humanitarian aid to Gaza ASAP. All friends of Israel should loudly and clearly say that any move to make the U.S.-Israel relationship a partisan one, as the House is doing, is a move that hurts Israel. That is what they do, unfortunately, harming our partnership with Israel by politicizing their aid package. I urge Speaker Johnson, quickly change course, Speaker Johnson, because this stunningly unserious proposal is not going to be the answer. It's not going anywhere. As I said, it's dead almost before it's born. Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
Mr. President, another election night in America, another win for women's choice, another win for democracy, another win for the Democratic agenda of jobs, infrastructure, lowering costs for the middle class. Another terrible defeat for the MAGA agenda. Americans don't want hard-right extremists to govern this country. At stake last night was a woman's right to choose in Ohio, the governorship in Kentucky, cannabis reform in Ohio, control of the legislature in Virginia, state Supreme Court seats, and so much more. In almost every major election, Democratic candidates and Democratic issues prevailed. This continued and strengthened a trend of Democratic victories last year. There is no possible takeaway from last night other than this. Americans fiercely oppose MAGA extremism, fiercely oppose total abortion bans, and want bipartisan leaders who can put America's needs first. After last night's results, I have a message to my Republican colleagues. When the MAGA agenda can't win in deep red Kentucky, or in Ohio, or help you in Virginia, it's time to recognize MAGA extremism is the wrong answer, not just for the country, but even for the GOP. I hope Republicans in Congress see that after last night, extremism must be rejected and bipartisanship embraced. Time will tell if House Republicans choose the right path. I want to say one more thing about the results in Ohio. With strong support, the people of Ohio have voted to legalize the recreational use of marijuana. Americans think it's long past time to enact cannabis reform. So here in the Senate, I'll continue to work with colleagues on both sides and my good friend Senator Brown to keep moving on bipartisan cannabis legislation as soon as we can. Mr. President, in the next 2 weeks, Congress must work together to avoid another pointless, damaging, unnecessary government shutdown. We also must work together to defend America's national security around the world by standing with Israel, standing with Ukraine, and increasing our defenses in the Indo-Pacific. And we must provide critical humanitarian assistance, including to civilians in Gaza who have nothing to do with Hamas, who need food and water and shelter. None of this will be easy to do. None of this is guaranteed to happen. The outcome of the next 2 weeks will hang on the same thing I've emphasized all year long: bipartisan cooperation. If Republicans are willing to work with Democrats in good faith on issues where there's real overlap, and there are many, then we can move forward on the things we must accomplish. But if Republicans inject partisanship into otherwise bipartisan priorities, that is only going to make it harder to avoid a shutdown, pass Israel aid, pass Ukraine aid, pass humanitarian aid for Gaza, and all of our other priorities. Yesterday, a group of Senate Republicans released a proposal for border security that they want in exchange for Ukraine funding. And they know full well what they came up with is a total non-starter. Instead of putting together common-sense border policies that can pass in divided government, Senate Republicans basically copy and pasted large chunks of the House's radical H.R. 2 bill. And that's their asking price for helping Ukraine. Making Ukraine funding conditional on the hard-right border policies that can't ever pass Congress is a huge mistake by our Republican colleagues. By tying Ukraine to border, Republicans are sadly making it harder, much harder, for us to help Ukraine in their fight against Putin. It sends a terrible signal to both our friends and adversaries. It will be a moment that history will remember if Ukraine aid is tied to this. Large segments of both parties in the Senate support Ukraine. Large segments of both parties in the Senate support Ukraine. So why on earth do some Republicans want to torpedo it by tying this H.R. 2 anchor to Ukraine funding? This move is only going to endanger Ukraine assistance in the long run. If Senate Republicans' open bid for border is an amalgamation of hard-right policies, then sadly the two parties are far apart, and we have a lot of work to do to bridge the divide. Now, I want to be clear. I'd like to bridge the divide. Our caucus would like to see some kind of common-sense border policies done, and the President would like to get something done, as his supplemental proposal shows. If we can come together in a bipartisan fashion to stop the flow of fentanyl and give our frontline officers the resources and tools they need to do their jobs and stop fentanyl, all while staying true to our values, that's what we should be doing. So today, we're going to keep working with our Republican colleagues to see if there's a chance for compromise. But if Republicans need to actually work, with us on realistic border policies, even if it's not everything they want. You can't get just a few Republicans who are pretty much on the hard right side of their party to say, here's what we want, take it or leave it. That won't work. Senate Republicans should not repeat the mistake of the House GOP when they tried to push H.R. 2. Their H.R. 2 bill is going nowhere, and this Senate GOP proposal is very close to H.R. 2. I've always been clear that I'm ready to have open, good faith, bipartisan negotiations. I was one of the authors of the Senate's comprehensive immigration bill from 2013. It was led by John McCain and me. I know what it's like to have hard conversation about these issues. I know through firsthand experience this topic is not easy. But nevertheless, I'm willing to have conversations about the border again if Republicans are willing to meet us halfway. We have so many shared bipartisan priorities to protect our nation, our national security. I hope partisanship doesn't tarnish our shared purpose. I hope we can work in the coming days to bridge the gap. Again, when Republicans willingly inject partisanship into issues that could have some bipartisan overlap, they make it extremely hard to get anything done. I urge my Republican colleagues to stop using the same approach again and again of taking bipartisan issues and injecting them with corrosive partisan measures that help sink them. Today's elections were another horrible defeat. Tuesday's elections, maybe today's too, who knows. But Tuesday's elections were another horrible defeat for MAGA extremism and another affirmation for the Democratic agenda of jobs, infrastructure, lowering costs for the middle class. By now, Republicans need to admit there's a pretty clear pattern at play. Ever since Donald Trump was elected president, the MAGA agenda has led to failure in big elections, in small elections, in red state elections, in blue state elections, and everything in between. And it shouldn't be any big mystery why MAGA candidates and MAGA issues keep turning out to be duds. Americans don't want hard-right extremists and the chaos they bring to govern this country. Americans don't support a MAGA agenda that has at its bedrock radical attacks on women's health care. Americans want their elected leaders to choose bipartisanship, to focus on people's lives instead of cable news shows. Sadly, Republicans seem mightily impervious to the obvious truth that MAGA equals disaster for America and for their party. And there's much more to do here in Congress right now that will demand exactly the kind of bipartisanship Americans have made clear they want. In a little over a week, the federal government will shut down if Congress does not come together to pass a bipartisan extension of funding. Today, I am taking the first procedural step for the Senate to move forward on a legislative vehicle we can use next week to pass a temporary extension to avoid a government shutdown. Over the next few days, Democrats will continue talking to Republicans about finding a path forward on avoiding a shutdown that both sides support. And I earnestly hope we can reach agreement sooner rather than later. No matter how negotiations evolve over the next week, one thing is not going to change. The only way, let me say it a third time, the only way we avoid a shutdown is with bipartisan cooperation, just as it was true in September and it will be true in the future. I implore Speaker Johnson and our House Republican colleagues to learn from the fiasco of a month ago. Hard-right proposals, hard-right slashing cuts, hard-right poison pills that have zero support from Democrats will only make a shutdown more likely. I hope they don't go down that path in the week to come. Now on nominations. Earlier this week, I'm proud to say, really proud, to say that the Senate majority confirmed the 100th woman to the federal bench since President Biden took office. And I'm equally proud to say it was the 150th judge overall. Today, the Senate will hit two more significant milestones. After we confirm Monica Almadani and Brandy McMillian today, this Senate majority will have confirmed 50 black judges and 100 people of color to the bench. Democrats are making our courts look more like America. This majority has confirmed more women, more black people, more people of color to the bench than any full term in any previous president. That's a record to be proud of. Under President Trump, just 16% of judicial nominees were people of color. Under President Biden and this Senate majority, 100 of the now more than 150 judges have been people of color. And yesterday, the Senate confirmed Ramon Reyes. Yesterday, the Senate confirmed Ramon Reyes as a district judge for the Eastern District of New York. Judge Reyes is now the only male federal judge of Puerto Rican descent and the second Hispanic man to ever sit on the Eastern District. Judge Reyes is a truly outstanding jurist who will be an excellent addition to the Eastern District. I was proud to recommend his nomination to President Biden, and even prouder to see him confirmed yesterday. On avoiding a government shutdown. It's a critical week here in the U.S. Capitol. This Friday at midnight, the federal government is going to shut down unless Congress acts first. The last thing the American people want to see is another unnecessary and painful government shutdown. Democrats certainly don't want to have a shutdown. And many of our Republican colleagues have likewise claimed they don't want to see one either. Even the mere act of approaching a shutdown is damaging. Last Friday, when Moody's announced they lowered the U.S. credit rating to negative, citing continued political polarization as one of its reasons, that proved to be true. The answer for avoiding a government shutdown is what I've been saying all along. Bipartisanship is necessary. I've said on multiple occasions that if we're going to work together to keep the government open, Speaker Johnson will have to avoid pushing steep cuts or poison pills that Democrats can't support. For now, I am pleased that Speaker Johnson seems to be moving in our direction by advancing a CR that does not include the highly partisan cuts that Democrats have warned against. The Speaker's proposal is far from perfect, but the most important thing is that it refrains from making steep cuts while also extending funding for defense in the second tranche of bills in February, not the first in January. Today, the House Rules Committee will take up the Speaker's bill, and that will give us the first indication of how committed Republicans are to keeping the government open. The next few days will tell all in the House, and I hope the Speaker does not buckle to the loud voices on his hard right flank to add partisan cuts as the price for keeping the government open. In divided government, extremists on one side cannot expect to dictate the agenda for the rest of Congress, especially when their views are so out of line with the majority of Congress and the majority of the American people. I hope Speaker Johnson recognizes that he will need support from Democrats in both chambers if he wants to avoid causing a shutdown. He needs to stay away from poison pills and steep hard right cuts for that to happen. I thank Chair Klobuchar and Chairman Reid for their good work on moving this important resolution. On the student debt CRA, as soon as today, Senate Republicans will force a vote on a cruel measure to eliminate President Biden's historic student loan repayment program and strip away a critical lifeline for millions and millions of borrowers. I strongly oppose this terrible Republican measure to deny American families a critical lifeline just 1 month after the pause on student loan payments ended. My Republican colleagues talk a big game about helping working families, but with this student debt congressional resolution, they are actively trying to block relief that would immediately improve the lives of so many working Americans. Their hypocrisy is glaring. Republicans are willing to give huge tax breaks to ultra-wealthy billionaires and large corporations. But when it comes to helping working families, Republicans refuse to give them the break. They say that costs too much money, but billionaire tax cuts don't. Give me a break. Right now, there are over 5.5 million borrowers enrolled in President Biden's SAVE plan, including nearly 300,000 in my home state of New York alone. So the worst thing we could do for these borrowers and these families right now is let this Republican CRA pass and strip away this critical lifeline. I will strongly oppose this Republican CRA to overturn student debt, and Democrats will keep working to make sure relief reaches every borrower in need. Madam President, we have until Friday to avert another costly, unnecessary, and avoidable government shutdown. Time is a luxury that neither side has. If we're going to keep the lights on beyond this Friday, our Republican colleagues will have to work with Democrats in a bipartisan way to pass a clean extension without hard right cuts and without poison pills. So far, I am heartened, cautiously so, that Speaker Johnson is moving forward with a CR that omits precisely the sort of hard right cuts that would have been non-starters for Democrats. I certainly don't agree with everything the President is proposing, and I can't imagine too many senators would have taken the Speaker's approach in drafting this bill. But the proposal before the House does two things Democrats have pushed for. It will avert a shutdown, and it will do so without making any terrible hard right cuts that the MAGA right wing demands. It also eliminates the poison pills that so many MAGA Congress members put in the bills. We will see over the course of today how the House moves forward. Over the past few days, a significant portion of the Speaker's hard right flank has torched his proposal precisely because it doesn't make cuts. I hope the Speaker does not yield to the demands of the hard right as we try to keep the government open. Instead, I hope the Speaker continues to recognize he will need Democratic votes in order to avoid a shutdown. On the student debt CRA today. Today, Senate Republicans continue their cruelty, their lack of connection with what people want and need, as they force a vote on a cruel measure to eliminate President Biden's historic loan repayment program, a punch to the gut for millions and millions of borrowers, the overwhelming majority of whom are working class, poor, or middle class. Let me be clear. I strongly, very strongly oppose this terrible Republican measure to deny American families relief from the crushing burden of student debt. My Republican colleagues like to talk a big game about helping working families, but with this Student Debt Congressional Review Act, they're actively trying to increase the pain on so many working Americans who need a hand in paying off their student loans. The hypocrisy is astounding on the other side of the aisle. Republicans don't think twice about giving huge tax breaks to ultra-wealthy billionaires and large corporations. But when it comes to helping out working families with student debt relief, suddenly it's too much money. It'll raise the deficit. We can't afford it. Give me a break. Cut taxes on multi-billionaires and tell a struggling student who's making $30,000, $40,000 a year that they can't get a little help on their student loans? That is so out of whack with what the American people want and care about. Let me be clear. The President's SAVE plan is a major lifeline for student loan borrowers to help get their financial houses in order. Over 5.5 million Americans are signed up and benefiting from this plan. So the worst thing we could do right now is let the Republican CRA pass and pull the rug out from under these borrowers' feet with no warning. I strongly oppose this Republican CRA to overturn student debt relief. Democrats will keep working to make sure relief reaches every borrower in need. On Senator Tuberville's blockade, before the end of the year, the Senate must put a stop to a grave abuse carried out by the senior senator from Alabama. The brazen, months and months long blockade of over 350 military nominees. The blockade of hundreds of military nominees to push the hard right view on abortion, something that the majority of Americans do not support. Let's look at what happened in the referenda results over the last 2 years. It is something never seen before in the Senate. It has cost our military preparedness dearly. It has thrown the lives of hundreds of families into limbo. Members on both sides of the aisle are reaching a boiling point with Senator Tuberville. And before the year is out, we're going to act to bring his blockade to an end. In the coming weeks, I will bring a resolution to the floor approved by the Rules Committee, allowing the Senate to quickly confirm the hundreds of military leaders that Senator Tuberville has obstructed. I thank Chairman Klobuchar and Senator Reid and everyone else who has championed this measure. And I hope my Republican colleagues who care about military preparedness end up supporting this resolution, or at least getting Senator Tuberville to back down. No matter what, we have an obligation to act, because Senator Tuberville's military holds are an anomaly in the history of the Senate. If every senator did what Senator Tuberville has done and held up military confirmations because of this or that partisan issue, no matter how deeply felt, it would grind the Senate to a halt. It would be a catastrophe for our military. We dare not go further down that road. We've gone too far already. To all of my colleagues who don't want to see the military forever ensnared in partisan fights, I urge them to support this resolution, or else implore Senator Tuberville to stand down. On the hostages, last week an agreement was reached for a pause of hostilities in the Gaza Strip to allow for the release of 50 Israeli hostages held by Hamas. This pause also allowed for the delivery of humanitarian aid for innocent civilians in Gaza. And just a few hours ago, it was reported that all sides have agreed to extend this pause for 2 more days to allow additional hostages to be released. I am so relieved that some of the hostages are coming home after enduring weeks of utter horror. I've met with many of their families. I've heard the pain they've been in. We've cried together in both Israel, in New York, and in Washington. And while much healing is ahead, I'm relieved